account for those in our public policies, and we just have not done that. And believe it or not, that could allow us to be outclassed in some of these national security relevant technologies, but we aim to avoid that situation.
Yeah. Well, it's a really important reminder. Let's not forget our strengths and strengths that have been built for 200 plus years. And those are the things that we should leverage. At the same time, it's good to weigh what I would say is the need for a it's already too late strategy. And you write about this in your piece in National Interest, the Tech Power Playbook. Before digging into some of the particulars, I'd love your high level on what are the key elements? What are the keys that we need to play on the keyboard with this playbook? Could you give us a high level on that, and then we can go into some of the particulars on chips and other things you are working on?
Well, I was trying to tease out of the Chips and Science Act lessons that I thought would be instructive, perhaps, to here and now. A new administration coming in with the Trump administration, a new Republican-controlled Congress. And there are a lot of varying opinions as it relates to the CHIPS Act. But I thought there were some important lessons that should not be forgotten. And I happen to believe the CHIPS Act has been more successful than I would have ever imagined. We've been able so far to unlock roughly $500 billion of private sector commitments. And I think roughly $30 billion of taxpayer money has actually flowed. So that's quite remarkable. And I expect, because we've begun this process of reshoring, not just big semiconductor fabricating facilities, but also the support infrastructure. And we've catalyzed the education of the next generation of technicians and designers and all the rest. We now will be an inviting country for future foreign direct investment and domestic investment. So those are the successes. But what has gone unheralded, I think until I wrote this essay in the National Interest, was the incredible work of our tech diplomats.
Yeah.
Our tech diplomats played a critical role in identifying the most vulnerable nodes to disruption, which would interrupt our access to semiconductors, whether they're the leading edge semiconductors used in weapon systems or instead more commoditized semiconductors, which are necessary for us to be able to assemble automobiles in this economy. They played a role in figuring out what those nodes were and identifying the best way to ensure that we could develop the redundancies and avoid these dependencies that are weaponized by the CCP and others. The other thing that our tech diplomats are equipped to do, and I hope they do it more in the future, is working on standards development. This could be especially important as we look to this age of AI and the increased need for semiconductors to create AI solutions. To the extent we can harmonize our standards, I spoke to this earlier, across international borders with our partners and our allies, there's a real geopolitical benefit to that. You can imagine them also playing a role in research collaboration and other important roles moving forward. And then, just a good in addition to them, and I say they're part of the special teams of this whole strategy. Let's play good offense and have a strong defense. Offense means that critical investment in our manufacturing capabilities for semiconductors. You could think about applying that model to other key technologies from quantum to biotechnology. And then having a strong defense means export controls. We don't want to have controls on the export of all technologies or all subsets of a technology. So we'll have some trade with the Chinese, of course, but we want to make sure that they don't have access to the best in class technologies at a given moment in time. In the case of semiconductors, we have mostly gotten right the export control regime, but that's sort of a moving target. And I want to
Right.
encourage this administration to retain export controls and always trying to optimize the regime.
That's a really great rundown of the things that you've laid out there. This tech diplomats idea, phenomenal. I wish more people would pay attention to this, because you make a really strong call for Secretary Rubio to think about what that looks like in the State Department. Of course, there's a Foreign Commercial Service in the Commerce Department. There is an XM Bank. There are all these tools available. They need to be organized in a way that will last for the next 20 years, for the next 30 years. You said it beautifully in the piece. You highlighted here. I just want to really foot stomp on this for folks who are listening. I think we need to focus on this, because God knows the PRC is out there with their technology and economic diplomats, or whatever you want to call them, out there in countries, from countries in Africa all the way to countries in Europe. And we need the same. Yeah. So I just wanted to jump on that, Senator. I think it's a great idea.
And so my argument to the Trump administration, thank you so much, because really that was the genesis of this article. The domestic manufacturing play was getting a lot of attention in the press. I think President Biden talked a lot about it, understandably and appropriately. Export controls were well publicized, but for a very, very modest amount of money. Our tech diplomats, highly sophisticated, well-trained, were out in the field really making this whole thing possible. And, for those of us who think that trading with like-minded nations still makes sense in certain contexts, which is everyone I know.
Yeah.
I think leveraging the comparative advantage of our most trusted allies and partners is going to be essential here. It would be unrealistic to try and reshore everything here in the United States, and probably suboptimal, because costs would go way up at a time we're 100%. Trying to address inflation. So that's one piece of this. And I would also emphasize something, a value proposition I haven't mentioned. When you say foreign commercial service, digital trade is going to be very important to the health of our innovation ecosystem. Yeah. So, in the end, our innovators need some markets to sell these things, and we need to keep grabbing market share. So the foreign commercial service and our tech diplomats can be incredibly helpful, opening up foreign markets so that we can keep growing as it relates to our tech power.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things you said there. I just want to make sure we double click on a couple of these. One is, you speak eloquently in the essay, and you have here about the role of trade, getting back to trade and in technology markets with our trusted allies, with like-minded partners, market-oriented economies, democracies, preferably. But we're in a different world right now when it comes to trade. Tariffs have gone into effect with Canada and Mexico. We are right in the midst of what could be a trade war. How should we think about this? Yeah.
Well, so I would say this. You're absolutely right. We're in the midst of a different world, and there's a lot of justification for the world to be different. But I would say that we need to take advantage of those comparative advantages. Sounds like a abstract economic concept, but let me make it more real. Countries that violate the rules of free and fair trade, we need to stop trading with them on the same terms we've been trading with them. So I think that reset is entirely appropriate.
Yeah.
I also think that those countries are especially bad bets when it comes to trusting them for as counterparties, or to do exchanges with them as it relates to our most critical technologies. And that's really my point of emphasis.
Right.
The last thing I would say is we need to be able to persuade our closest large economy, democratic country allies. That would be Japan.
Right.
That would be the Europeans and others, to work with us in this tech effort. And when it comes to, say, export controls, to coordinate activities with them and vice versa. Otherwise, this is going to be a race to the bottom in which when one country imposes export controls, others go in and steal market share. Right. So we have to act together, and that's how we bring bad countries into a position of better behavior.
Yeah.
And so that's how I'm thinking about it. In terms of particular tariff rates with particular countries, my hope is that these tariffs will be temporary and targeted. My hope is that the intention is to get our counterparties, say Canada, to the table so that we can negotiate either economic or non-economic issues. And then after we go through a negotiation and reach an outcome that is mutually acceptable with both sides, then we resume normal economic relations, knowing that if either side steps back into a position of misbehavior, there will be consequences. So that's my understanding of where we're headed.
Yeah.
And that's my hope, certainly.
Well, that really helps us make sense of things and gives us a longer-term perspective. I've always felt that with the tariffs, the enduring test of all these tariffs is going to ultimately be what you've talked about. How does it help us innovate better on technologies that are going to be important for shaping the future? Like, that's the enduring test for all of this stuff, and we should keep our eyes on the prize. And I think you've helped us think about how to do that. I also agree that something for something is good. It's like it can't be something for nothing. So there's value to the conversation that we're having right now. There's another piece to this, and I wanted to ask you, because you write about this in your essay and you've talked about this before. Internationally, either you give market access and you have trade, or you have deep pockets. Certainly the PRC offers both. And I remember working on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and one of the constant refrains was, hey, it's either deep pockets or it's market access. And so you talk in your essay about the importance of financing for critical and emerging technologies and critical and emerging technology value chains. Everything from critical minerals to intermediate and end products. You talked about the role of the multilateral development banks that could be useful. I'm a 20-year ex-World Banker, and I'll tell you one thing is that you'll give me a second here because I want to get your thoughts on this. It's one thing to leverage those institutions, which we helped create, leverage them more aggressively, their balance sheets, so you could scale resources. But if we don't address problems on the back end, which is the lion's share of international competitive bidding on works is won by Chinese companies, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So I've wondered whether we need a financial engine, an American financial engine, to help on critical and emerging tech around the world. Maybe that's DFC, maybe that's something else. What are your thoughts on this, Senator? And do I have this right?
Well, actually, I do think you have it right. I don't know that there's a particular appetite at this moment. In fact, I sense there's not a political appetite as more than the political environment could bear to propose creating a new entity. Mm-hmm. So whether that would be optimal or not, or I'll let others debate that point. But I think we have underutilized, and I make the argument, as you indicate in the national interest essay, we've underutilized the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and other such regional development institutions. We've not insisted that as we participate in these institutions and help fund them, that the leadership pursue strategies and policies that are consistent with our national interests. Yeah. We've really been inattentive, frankly, to the importance of them. And I think there's going to be a growing hue and cry in as early as the next couple of years by the Global South and others to have deeper participation in this tech revolution.
Yeah.
From artificial intelligence to emerging biotech and beyond. And we're going to have to work with them to figure that out. It will be advantageous to the United States to do so. And my hope is that these development banks can play a really important role. And that they'll look to American tech solutions moving forward. I actually think we failed to properly leverage American innovators and our private sector companies as well. There is an enormous opportunity for American companies to outflank China's Tech Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at East Africa, for example, the Chinese have been inserting themselves there. They deployed Huawei solutions, and they aim to be the provider of choice of AI technology and move that region towards techno-autocratic solutions. And therefore have a measure of control over the information they have access to, and impose through regional leaders a economic and autocratic governance model. So that's of great concern to the United States. From a purely mercantilist perspective, we want our solutions there, right? We want Microsoft to partner with G42 to work with the Kenyan government to deploy solutions on the ground and be the first mover in Africa to provide regionally relevant and trained models to serve that population. And then we'll have an ongoing customer for our tech companies and be able to nudge those countries towards the values they probably prefer, all things equal. Those are the United States and our allies. So that's my vision. That's my private sector answer, properly scoped with the right regulatory environment to the Chinese Belt and Road, big government, techno-autocratic model. And the development banks can augment these private investments so that the hurdle rate isn't as daunting and the payback is sooner than it would otherwise be. And I look forward to working on this in any way I can moving forward.
It is so great that you raised this. The technological analog to the Belt Road Initiative, which is what the Chinese are offering, is going to be our next big challenge. And I think you've really articulated it well. The dynamism of the U.S. private sector, our comparative advantage, our ability to build long-term relationships, particularly around technology. This is the future for a number of countries that could potentially be important export markets for us. So thank you so much, Senator, for raising that. Let me bring it back home to the U.S. and CHIPS. You talked about the CHIPS Act. You are a co-author of the CHIPS Act, bipartisan legislation. Again, greatly admire the work that you've done on that. Of course, President Trump voiced some opposition, at least to the use of subsidies to promote chip manufacturing. But I thought it's worth reflecting on, what's actually been working. And you give some examples about. You mentioned some data already, but some examples in your writings about foreign direct investment in chips. And we're going to pull up a chart here on FDI in the semiconductor sector. And hopefully our folks can see this. What's really astounding, really since 2019, and then really in an accelerated way over the last few years, is FDI in semiconductor manufacturing in the US. Wow, look at these numbers relative to China. And I would add to this that at the 10th annual Select USA Summit last year, another $60 billion were committed in chip manufacturing in the US. So there's something significant happening here. And of course, we know about the TSMC announcement of $100 billion along with President Trump. All good news for the US. Tell us how we should think about this. Is this going to sustain? What is needed for it to sustain?
Well, the market demand is so you have the pull factor, right, of individual consumers increasingly wanting more chips or wanting the downstream product of the chips in the form of amazing new medicines developed with the help of AI solutions, and they want access to large language models, which are breathtaking in their application, or they want access to smart city technology paired with artificial intelligence so that we can eliminate traffic in this country. And you just go on and on. So I'm trying to make real and very accessible to regular people what this is all about. So we're going to get a lot more demand for chips, which is one of the reasons the imperative for passing this legislation was so great. Yeah. And our warfighters are going to need more chips to hopefully avoid conflict and to make us more secure in the event of any kind of potential conflict breaking out. So that's the demand factor. But will you see more investment in American production in particular? Absolutely. One of the reasons I believe that is because it takes a support ecosystem of service providers and component manufacturers and whole support ecosystem every time a fab is located in this country.
Yeah.
Well, much of that support infrastructure is now in place through the previous administration's efforts, enabled by the CHIPS Act, working with private sector partners. We've gone through the hard work of getting essential pieces of this ecosystem to de-risk supply chains in this country, and many of those things won't have to be reconstituted or reshored to the United States every time a new fab or a new wing of a fab is planned here in this country. So that's point number one. Point number two is the American people are going to insist that their policymakers prepare us against the contingency of another mass interruption of a public health event like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
They've had a lot of years and a lot of us warning policymakers about the horrible scenario, what it could mean to our entire way of life if we don't have enough chips. So the political risk of failing to act and failing to ensure that we make more resilient our supply chain has really gone off the charts. So I think all of our leaders are resolved. Everyone in this administration wants to reshore semiconductor production. There may be some disagreements about exactly what that looks like, and there will no doubt be some changes that are brought to the CHIPS and Science Act. I frankly embrace some of those ideas.
Yeah.
But I think there should be little doubt that we will continue this very important effort that began in recent years.
Thank you for that, Senator. There's something else on this which I wanted to zoom in on, which is R&D. And you talked about the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act, which needs more attention. And I'm conscious of the fact that if you look at this chart, for example, public R&D, public investment in R&D has fallen since its peak in the 60s. It was about 1.8%, 1.86% of GDP to about a third, 0.66. And now, for sure, private sector R&D has grown significantly, but they may not be doing the same thing. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, completely agree. So thank you for starting there.
Yeah.
We invest in especially curiosity-driven, fundamental research, but even some applied research areas, especially in the physical sciences, for research which yields not just immediate private sector opportunities from time to time, but research that instead solves collective problems that won't be paid for by individual market players, individual consumers, or individual companies. So an example would be national security.
Yeah.
We think nothing about paying a big defense contractor a bunch of money to build a ship, and we should not. I mean, we should scrutinize those investments and make sure they're absolutely necessary and appropriate. But a private economy is not going to build you Navy ships, right? That's a national shared priority.
Yeah.
You can think of public health. The same thing applies, and natural disaster avoidance and preparation. So there's these discrete research areas, and increasingly, to connect the dots here, our warfare, our method of warfare is dependent on dual use technology. So the fact that private investment's gone up is very important, but the public stuff is still essential, and this is an age of tech power.
Yeah.
So our entire military overmatch. It's been called the revolution in military affairs, and then there's been these various DoD offsets that we tried to out-innovate and out-compete our competitors through superior technology. Well, those are dependent on a lot of public investment, and that has been tapering off. So I would make that critical point. I'm also making the point, however, that we need to keep investing and incentivizing investment in private sector R&D, which is why I have led the R&D deduction legislation. So you still get tax benefits in this country from investing in R&D. And for pre-profitable companies, I think we could justify a tax credit for those companies. We need more innovation in this country, as much great innovation as we have. Subsidizing innovation in this country is something I absolutely agree with. And as a conservative, I was heartened that George Will wrote a column really applauding this idea not too long ago. And so there's a fair amount of support on both sides of the aisle for this. I think this will find its way, the tax provisions in the tax reform legislation that Congress is working on. But we still have some work to do in making the argument that these public research investments are important. Public health is one, I think, accessible example of where consistently we do this well and where our companies depend on research findings. Use the example of diabetes. In my family, we've had some folks who've had diabetes over the years, and they've been able to manage their condition through diabetes drugs that originated with findings that occurred through the National Science Foundation. It was the saliva of a Gila monster that somehow had the secret sauce to allow us to control diabetes. So you just never know, even with some of these research studies that can be embarrassing, right? They end up oftentimes having a real logical rationale behind them. So I'll keep making that argument. The CHIPS and Science Act proposed increasing funding rather than seeing decreasing funding as we have since the space race occur through our important public institutions. And we do have a lot of public support for that. I'm starting to hear from the business community, and which is welcome, about how important their business models, especially Silicon Valley, are tied to public research at great universities like Stanford and so forth.
Well, I mean, just to underscore this, we are certainly in a period of government efficiency. There's a lot of vigorous effort around that, but we are also in an era of government-business collaboration, and that takes different forms. At least that's what I'm taking away from some of the things you're saying. I would be remiss if I don't ask you one last and very important question, which is so much of the tech race and American reindustrialization and tech competitiveness depends on our workforce, our people. Could you share with us your wisdom on this point?
Well, it all comes down to people, doesn't it? Or it all goes back to the creative ideas that are harnessed by, in this case, individual Americans that go out and do something useful with these ideas. And the CHIPS and Science Act could be thought of as an investment in human capital. I often think of it in those terms. So through the CHIPS Act, I think it was well reported in my state that Purdue University has been training a number of folks, very sophisticated electrical engineers and people in material science so that they can work in the semiconductor industry. Indiana University also doing very important work in this field and in the area of informatics, and many of them are contributing after graduation mightily to the DoD and nearby Crane Naval Base, its mission to develop and optimize next-generation technologies. Ivy Tech Community College, which is our statewide community college system, has developed a dedicated training program that will hand out certificates to Hoosiers and those who locate in the Hoosier state for semiconductor work so that they can be technicians at these fabs. If we don't have a requisite supply of capable workers, we won't be landing the foreign direct investment that is necessary. This was a key point of emphasis for Secretary Raimondo in implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act. She and our Secretary of State visited Purdue University to highlight the importance of this issue a couple of years ago following the CHIPS Act. We need more people to sign up. And it's not just for semiconductors, for other areas of emerging tech so that they can help us win this tech power competition from the technician level up to the postdoc level, and so that our values prevail, not the values of the Chinese Communist Party, so that we can have some rules-based order based on our Enlightenment values of the Declaration of Independence, not the law of the jungle. It all comes down to having trained people. And I would put in this one final word to demonstrate that I don't think everything needs to be done in national capitals. We need a better, a more effective pre-K through 14 system. We need to better educate our young people. We need to inspire them in this age of technology to study seriously science, tech, engineering, math, and have more than a passing familiarity with these technologies and their importance so that we can produce a highly productive workforce that can become rich and lead meaningful lives. And we bring everyone along, also part of the CHIPS Act, so that we can invest in all geographies and we will have people capable of providing the sorts of services that are needed by these tech companies. I think we can do it. I think we're up to the task. But that, as much as anything else, is the generational challenge as it relates to tech power in the United States.
That's a powerful message, Senator. Thank you. Thank you for joining us and your leadership across the country on this important issue. We are delighted to start with you on this podcast series, and I hope it catches fire. And we'll be watching what you're doing next. So thank you, sir. And I want to thank the audience for joining this inspiring conversation with Senator Young. You could find this episode of Betting on America and more on csis.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everybody has a role to play in winning.
We have the broadest, deepest capital markets in the world.
Yeah.
We've got amazing and best-in-class research universities. We've got national labs that are highly impressive. We get, on and on. We have all these benefits, but we really do need to account for this new order in which the Chinese are looking for vulnerabilities, whether it's IP insecurity or extended supply chains, or their ability to subsidize certain components or certain products in ways that will put our companies out of business. And we need to account for those in our public policies. And we just have not done that. Yeah. And believe it or not, that could allow us to be outclassed in some of these national security relevant technologies, but we aim to avoid that situation.
Yeah. Well, it's a really important reminder. Let's not forget our strengths and strengths that have been built for 200 plus years. And those are the things that we should leverage. At the same time, it's good to weigh what I would say is the need for a it's already too late strategy. And you write about this in your piece in National Interest, the Tech Power Playbook.
And I think there's going to be a growing hue and cry in as early as the next couple of years by the Global South and others to have deeper participation in this tech revolution.
Yeah.
From artificial intelligence to emerging biotech and beyond. And we're going to have to work with them to figure that out. It will be advantageous to the United States to do so. My hope is that these development banks can play a really important role. That they'll look to American tech solutions moving forward. I actually think we failed to properly leverage American innovators and our private sector companies as well. There is an enormous opportunity for American companies to outflank China's Tech Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
You look at East Africa, for example. The Chinese have been inserting themselves there. They've deployed Huawei solutions, and they aim to be the provider of choice of AI technology and move that region towards techno-autocratic solutions. And therefore have a measure of control over the information they have access to, and impose through regional leaders a economic and autocratic governance model. So that's of great concern to the United States.
Why are quantum technologies a must-win for the United States? How can the emerging quantum corridor in Illinois help the United States take the pole position? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, president of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department. And today we speak with Illinois Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, ranking member of the House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist. Congressman Krishnamurthy, thank you for joining us. We're really happy to have you on the podcast today.
Hey, thank you so much, Navin.
Let's get into quantum. You have been a leader on critical and emerging technologies, and in particular, an advocate for U.S. leadership on quantum technologies. Why quantum? What's at stake for the United States?
Well, thank you for your attention to this subject. Quantum is one of those technologies of the future that will determine, in my opinion, who will win the race for prosperity, for wealth, for upgrading the standards of living of their population. And we want to be the winners. And quantum, in very layman's terms, because that's the only way that I'm going to understand this subject, is it's almost like the next generation of supercomputing. It is the ability for us to solve certain mathematical problems and other challenges that are beyond the reach of even today's supercomputers. And so Chicago is one of the world hubs for quantum technology. And so hopefully we as a country can leverage that strength in Illinois and in Chicago.
You've talked about quantum computing there, which is really important. And there are other applications I think you've talked about in the past, quantum information, quantum sensing, all of which are different applications of this powerful technology. What's interesting, and I know you're on this topic often, which is what the Chinese are doing and how the PRC is really investing significantly in this area as well. How do we stack up in your view?
I think that we're neck and neck in terms of kind of the state of our technology versus theirs. The difference is that they are spending a lot of resources to take the lead, and they're doing so obviously in the private sector, but in the public sector. I mean, they've invested something like $16 billion last year in quantum alone. We are at like $4 billion in the U.S. in public spend on this particular issue. And so with that kind of spending, with that type of investment, we can't just sit idly by and let them race past us.
I think you've underscored it. Multiples more public spending on quantum, an emerging technology where the market is still fledgling. That's a really important point you mentioned. Now, we may be ahead on private investment, but where the technology is right now requires a public investment, I think is what you're saying. And what's interesting is CSIS has just put out a commission report that says that in some areas, like quantum communications, China is ahead, although not across the board, but certainly in that application. Tell us what we can do to catch up, particularly on public investment.
Well, first of all, I think the number one issue, the rate determining step, from what I can gather, talking to people in the quantum sector, is our workforce. We just don't have enough talent. For every 3 jobs in this particular field, we can only fill 1 of them. And for the other kind of high-tech jobs in this field, many of them are immigrants. And our immigration system is really screwed up right now, to the point where it's, unfortunately, it's basically causing uncertainty. It's causing researchers and others to question whether America should be the place where they do their research. And we can't afford to have that. We got to attract and retain the very best talent from around the world in this field, as well as others.
Understood. And you have been a leader on the workforce agenda when it comes to critical and emerging technology, including quantum. Tell us a little bit more on what your thoughts are on a game plan. So there's the homegrown talent that we need to develop and cultivate around STEM for areas like quantum and other critical and emerging technologies. You've mentioned the immigration piece. How do we strike the right balance between these, and what should we be doing?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think nurturing that homegrown talent is crucial. I actually convened a roundtable last week at the Chicago Quantum Exchange, which is a really neat group of entities who've come together. These are universities, it's Fermi, it's Argonne, it's University of Chicago, University of Illinois, but it also includes the aldermen from the area. It includes educators, community colleges. And the idea is this, which is, okay, here are our needs within the quantum field. How can we train people at the youngest levels to be interested, and then to later develop that interest into, skills that can be applicable in this field? And so those aldermen are really crucial because they know the kids in the neighborhood, so to speak, and they bring them to the quantum park. We actually have it's called IQMP, Illinois Quantum Park, which is on the southeast side of Chicago on Lake Michigan. And it's basically developing old steel mills, or the area formerly occupied by steel mills that have gone dormant, and basically reimagining that space as where we're going to have a quantum industry. If I can go back to that immigration piece for just 1 second, I'm glad that President Trump said that he believes that, first, he believes in H-1Bs, which is a key part of every high-tech field, including quantum. But he also talked about potentially stapling a green card to people's higher educational diplomas, whether it's a PhD or a master's in some of these high-tech fields. I think that type of innovation in the immigration space would be very welcome in quantum.
There's so many things that you said there that strike a chord. There is a competition not for technology only, but for the talent that can build technology capabilities, and that's global, and we need to understand that. And the second thing, which I thought was really striking from the story that you described in Chicago, is that it's a matter of policy and choice how technology and technology innovation benefits the population at large. It's not something that happens automatically. It requires work. But then it's to everyone's benefit. And so let me ask you something there, which is that the skills we're talking about when we say quantum or any other technology is not just PhD scientists, if I understand it correctly. There are all kinds of skill levels that are needed to actually build the backbone for quantum technologies in the United States. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Only a fraction of the types of people that are necessary in the quantum field, require a very highly advanced degree. A lot of the others are going to be technologists. They're going to be electrical engineers or people who are interested in that field, but now are applying those skills in quantum. It's going to be HVAC people because of the need for tremendous cooling for this type of technology. In short, I believe, after talking to these educators as well as what I call quantum activists, if you will,
right,
that basically it requires people with an aptitude, but more than that, an interest in the area. And if we can just have people with an aptitude and interest, we can teach them the skills that would make them useful in the field.
Powerful. Let me ask you something about Illinois. We are very interested at CSIS in our department in understanding how local communities can help us compete globally. And the story of the Chicago Quantum Exchange and the corridor you're building in Chicago and Urbana-Champaign is really striking. So tell us a little bit more about why you're betting on Illinois.
Well, I'm betting on Illinois because Illinois bet on me, Navin. My family, I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, and my parents immigrated there. And what can I say? Illinois has done so much for my family, but the reason why we should bet on Illinois for quantum is because University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Northwestern, University of Chicago, Fermilab, Argonne, plus the huge concentration of headquarters of Fortune 500 companies in that area make it not only a place to innovate in the quantum field because of the huge concentration of physicists, for instance, in Illinois, but also a place to apply those innovations in solving everyday problems and then commercializing those solutions. So you have kind of potentially from end to end the ability to make quantum useful for people's everyday lives.
So that's striking. There is the private sector, there's university capabilities, there's the community. All of these coming together generate the competitive advantage for why you would bet on Illinois, or why we should bet on Illinois, as you've said. Let me now shift gears for a second, because what you've described here is how we go on the offense, whether it's quantum or any other technology. But you've also been a leader on the importance of defensive tools. In other words, you can't just pretend that you're going to build the capabilities while you have real threats from our adversaries. I would call them malign threats in some cases, sort of IP theft and things like that, as well as mercantilist threats, particularly when you have non-market actors like the PRC operating in technology value chains where we're trying to build a competitive advantage. So you have advocated strongly for the use of export controls and other such tools. Help us, bring us into this, Congressman. Tell us why those are important, even as we invest on the offense.
Well, I think that with regard to these export controls, for instance, the idea here is let's not export stuff that could be used against us. If I had to make it super simple, whether it is high-end semiconductor chips, whether it's money, let's not put it, let's not have it deployed in a way that could, for instance, help modernize the People's Liberation Army, or be used to persecute minorities or Uyghurs or Hong Kongers or surveil dissidents. I mean, be used in ways that would go against our values also. So we have tried to work with whoever is willing to listen to us, whether it's the Biden administration, now the Trump administration, on a bipartisan basis to, I think, reflect what the American people want, which is they want us to continue to work with trusted partners and have good relationships where we can do business But then with other countries that might be considered strategic adversaries, let's be careful.
Yeah. The export control agenda kind of begs the question around impact and enforcement. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because this is sort of one of the legacies of the Biden administration. Like, how do you actually ensure effective implementation of these? Could you share some of your thoughts on that, Congressman?
Well, I think that, if you take, for instance, the high-end chip issue, what we see is that they definitely bite. The export controls do have the intended effect. You don't have to go further than just asking, Mr. Liang, the founder of DeepSeek, like, what's the number one barrier to your advancement as a company? He says, well, it's these export controls, because they stockpiled a bunch of chips before the export controls went into effect, but they don't have access to the next generation of chips. Okay.
Yeah.
So they do have a bite. That being said, we know that there are workarounds, let's say, that the CCP is engineering through other countries and in other ways. And so we have to be nimble in dealing with those workarounds and tightening the restrictions where necessary, and then also just being smart in terms of deploying additional technology to maybe gate the diffusion of some of this technology. One of the most interesting things that I learned about is yesterday, CNAS had a presentation about how there's technology to essentially put sensors within chips that would essentially disable them if they end up getting geolocated in certain places they shouldn't be, right? I mean, that's the type of technology that we should be thinking about in the future.
Yeah.
We don't want this stuff in the hands of bad actors.
Yeah. An interesting perspective on what trusted chips could look like going forward. But I think you really are shining a light on what the enforcement capabilities are that we need to actually support effective implementation of export controls. So that's one element of trade. And let me sort of round out with the other element of trade, which is tariffs. We are now kind of well into the era of Trump 2.0 tariffs. I think we seem to have averted for now, momentarily, a North American trade war, but there's certainly a bigger question around tariffs and the role of that instrument in the economic relations with other countries. I've always said that, like, the enduring test for tariffs are going to be whether they help or hinder technology innovation and competition, and our ability to compete. Do you have any perspective on how we should think about tariffs in the context of quantum or other technologies?
So my 30,000 foot perspective on this is that you need tariffs to deal with potential economic aggression that another country pursues.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if it pursues dumping, which the CCP has actively pursued for China over decades, with regard to aluminum or steel or solar panels or electric vehicles, well, in that case, we should adopt strategic tariffing to try to level the playing field for our domestic producers, and perhaps change behavior over time with regard to China.
Yeah.
However, if you're going to slap across the board tariffs on everything from, noodles to diapers to every other product that another country is making, well, in that case, it looks like to me two things are happening. One, you're just raising prices without really specifying what behavior needs to change in the offending country in order for the tariffs to go away. And then two, you're potentially starting a trade war where there are going to be retaliatory tariffs on your stuff. So if we then look at quantum or technologies of the future, I think that, yes, we should be concerned about any type of technology, whether it's low-end semiconductor chips that the Chinese use to dump on the rest of the market that we're going to have to tariff. But where a country is not practicing economic aggression in the traditional sense of the term, they're just better at making something. Well, let's take advantage of that and let's innovate on our own and incorporate that technology into our stuff to make better stuff. I mean, that's just the bottom line. That's how economics works, I think. So, I think we want to continue to be very cautious here and not start like, I think the Wall Street Journal said the dumbest trade war in history between us and Canada. That's just not a good way to go.
Well, you've kind of underscored what is time-tested and stress-tested, which is the ability of the American innovation system to generate repeated wins and the need for us to keep our eyes on the prize when it comes to that. So I really appreciate your perspectives today and your leadership on a number of fronts, including quantum in Illinois, and critical and emerging tech in general. So Congressman, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. And you didn't even make me tell a Schrodinger's cat joke today. So thank you so much for not making me have to do my quantum jokes.
Well, if you want, we could let you do one.
Well, my staff instructed me to tell you that the best illustration of my knowing quantum is that I don't understand quantum. So I guess that's supposed to be really funny. So thank you.
That would be you and me. Thank you, Congressman. I greatly appreciate you. Thank you for joining this eye-opening conversation with Congressman Krishnamurthy. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more on csis.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the
Quantum is one of those technologies of the future that will determine, in my opinion, who will win the race for prosperity, for wealth, for upgrading the standards of living of their population. And we want to be the winners. And quantum, in very layman's terms, because that's the only way that I'm going to understand this subject, is it's almost like the next generation of supercomputing. It is the ability for us to solve certain mathematical problems and other challenges that are beyond the reach of even today's supercomputers. And so Chicago is one of the world hubs for quantum technology. And so hopefully we as a country can leverage that strength in Illinois and in Chicago.
And you have been a leader on the workforce agenda when it comes to critical and emerging technology, including quantum. Tell us a little bit more on what your thoughts are on a game plan. So there's the homegrown talent that we need to develop and cultivate around STEM for areas like quantum and other critical and emerging technologies. You've mentioned the immigration piece. How do we strike the right balance between these, and what should we be doing?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think nurturing that homegrown talent is crucial. I actually convened a roundtable last week at the Chicago Quantum Exchange, which is a really neat group of entities who've come together. These are universities, it's Fermi, it's Argonne, it's University of Chicago, University of Illinois, but it also includes the aldermen from the area. It includes educators, community colleges. And the idea is this, which is, okay, here are our needs within the quantum field. How can we train people at the youngest levels to be interested and then to later develop that interest into, skills that can be applicable in this field?
Why is venture capital indispensable for U.S. national security? Why is it essential for investors, government, and industry to join forces to innovate critical technologies faster, better, and bigger? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, and today I'm speaking with Mike Brown, partner at Shield Capital and former director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the Department of Defense. Mike Brown, so delighted to have you. I have been admiring your work across industry, government, and now in the investment community. You have been a leader on national security investing, and really happy to have you here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Navin, you're way too kind. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic, which I'm passionate about.
Excellent. Well, let's get started with the big picture. I was reading your testimony to the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the CCP, and you argued there, and I quote, "We must prepare the American people for a multi-generational competition with China." And you locate this competition fundamentally around our ability to innovate and innovate technologies faster, better, and at scale. And that, in turn, is really about the quality of our innovation ecosystem here in the United States. So bring us into that. What is the most important thing we need to know about the quality and the health of our technology innovation system here?
I think technology is ground zero for the competition between the US and China. And you can see that reflected in the value of tech stocks in the marketplace, the amount of interest that gets generated when DeepSeek is released, et cetera. This is going to be the fundamental determinant of both economic prosperity and national security. By that, I mean technology and innovation. If we think about where the U.S. innovation system is, it's basically the same system that we've had since the end of World War II, that Vannevar Bush developed under President Truman, which is the origin of the National Science Foundation. I think this has served us well, but it served us well in a time when America was preeminent in science and technology, when we didn't really have competitors who could match our scale. Yeah, we had the Soviet Union, but they were never a match for the US from an economic standpoint in terms of using technology beyond the military to create a successful economy. Now we have a competitor who's clearly doing that and is, at a much bigger scale relative to the US than where the Soviets were. So I think what we need to think about to improve our system is not a complete overhaul, but we're not spending enough. So we're not fueling that system with what's made it go since World War II. If we go back to the 1960s as an example, we were spending 2% of GDP on basic research as a government. And now that number is down to 0.6%. Half of which is now spent on health initiatives after the pandemic. I'm sure we'd all agree that's a good thing. Yeah. But that means the basic research for national security purposes is now down to 0.3%. That's not the profile of a country that really wants to secure its future and make sure that we're preeminent in science and technology for the next few decades, as we have been in the past few decades. So number one, we need to spend more. And then I'd say, the other area we need to pay attention to relative to China is commercialization of that technology. As the National Defense Strategy has talked about since the time of the first Trump administration, the advantage goes to the competitor who adopts technology and is able to use it. So it's not just the discovery of something, which is now technologies easily diffused around the globe. Meaning you don't have an advantage by inventing something and hanging on to it for a decade or more. It's going to diffuse around the world. You've got to adopt that technology and spread it through the economy, and that's what leads to the economic prosperity part of what we want for our future.
Yeah, this is a great picture that you've provided, like a great perspective on how things have evolved through time. And, I think many people probably now a cliche about the valley of death. You talk about commercialization. Tell us a little bit more about this, especially for folks who are not that close to it. Why is that transition from R&D to R&D commercialization so important, and why has there been a gap in the United States?
Well, the gap exists because there can be a delay between when something is discovered or invented and when it's ready for commercialization. And in the case of the government, which has been the largest source historically, if I look over the last 50 or 60 years, of the basic research, and still is spending more for basic research than the private sector. But now the private sector is spending more in R&D than the government is. So that means the private sector is relying on the government for R&D. Technology sometimes will need the funding to be able to be more widely adopted. In the government's case, that is waiting for congressional appropriation and government contract. And that is a valley of death if the government wants to commercialize something for use in defense, as an example. Our budget cycle is 3 years. So if we take more and more of the technology that is being developed in the private sector versus the government, which is a change from 60 years ago, now we're more dependent on the government budget cycle to fund R&D in small companies, and cash flow is the lifeblood of small companies. So that's the valley of death. We've got a technology that we want to deploy, but we're waiting for government contracts to show up.
I want to come back to this topic. It's something that you have been talking about for quite some time, and it's really critical if we're going to win the tech race, or at least stay ahead of it. Before I do that, let me pull up a chart that you've used in one of your recent papers on venture capital, and it really shows how China is leading on a number of technologies and catching up on some other ones where we're in the lead. And you could see that here on the screen. You just look at this list of technologies that China's ahead, and some like artificial intelligence where we're ahead, but I don't think we can rest on our laurels.
Yeah.
Right, not by much. And you mentioned DeepSeek. Now, I show this because you say technology, but it also matters which technologies. And one of the things you've done is you've advocated for an advanced industry strategy for the United States centered around critical and emerging technologies. So which ones are we talking about here, and how would you help us think about prioritizing the ones that matter most for this advanced industry strategy?
Well, fortunately, we have a couple of different sources where the government has already spent time saying what are the critical technologies. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy has traditionally offered a list. The CTO of the Pentagon has also offered a list. And if we compare these lists, they're not very different. And I don't think it would take us too long to think through what are the ones that we think will be most critical for the future. So semiconductors would clearly be there, because chips and AI, which are powered by these chips, are really fundamental to any of these advanced technologies. Then you could add fusion to that, so a source of unbelievable energy. Quantum, understanding the quantum effects and how that applies to computing, communications, and sensing. Synthetic biology, which is that it's very beginning, but could have a huge impact on society. And then space. Those are the ones I would say are absolutely fundamental. What I'm arguing for those that are more hardware intensive, semiconductors, fusion, synthetic biology, those need a little more help than some of those that are software intensive, because also on the list would be cybersecurity and AI.
Yeah.
Those, fortunately, because they're software, do not need help from the government to advance. We have plenty of private capital and plenty of interested sources of that capital, venture capital, where I'm sitting today, which are happy to produce more software-oriented technologies. It's the hardware, more capital-intensive technologies where the risk is a bit higher, where venture capital is not flowing in as rapidly or as freely. Yeah. That's where I think government has a role to play. And it's really evidence of, in our system, the money, the sources of these technology development is flowing to where the profitability is highest, not to where the national capability need is highest. I think this is the difference between our system and China. China is much less focused on efficiency of capital, which we call return on investment.
Yeah.
They want to get a capability for the nation, and are less concerned about what the financial metrics are associated with that.
Yeah.
We're obsessed in our economy, because it's market-based, with this return on investment, which will have us develop a dating app maybe ahead of Fusion because it's more profitable. It's easier to develop.
Yeah. And given your work in industry before, in your previous incarnation, you have been close to this, both in the cyberspace, in the digital space in general. But let me break down a couple of things here which you've raised, which I think are really important points. Number one, which sets of technologies? There is broad consensus across government, across political spectrum, across economists, across investors, across technologists on the technologies that are going to have an outsized impact on the future of long-term productivity growth, on our economy. Certainly, AI is in the news and the AI stack, but there are other ones as well. The way I think about it is that we're in the midst of not one Sputnik moment, but maybe 5 at the same time, and we know what those are.
Right.
And so what's really important here is that there is a rationale for focus, which you have provided in some of your writings and in your talks. The second thing you've said, which is really important, I want to double click on that, and you've mentioned it, but just like elaborate a little bit more, which is that VC in the US has historically focused on software where you have a shorter term horizon to harvest returns relative to the capital intensive hardware focused ventures that you're talking about. Tell us a little bit about the history of this, just as a background for what you've already told us.
Yeah, well, the irony is that the semiconductor industry, which is so critical to the future of all these technologies that we've talked about, the advanced industries of the future, all based on semiconductors. That was obviously a capital-intensive technology and one developed by the Defense Department. Mm-hmm. The Defense Department and the space program in the 60s really needed this technology. The space program, obviously, for use in Apollo. At one point, the Apollo program was using 2/3 of the output of the semiconductor industry. So kind of amazing that government was a first customer of this leading technology. And then the Defense Department needed it to miniaturize electronics for nuclear weapons. So in that time, the government was an early adopter and not a direct funder in terms of providing equity funding, but through its purchases of big quantities of the industry output was really funding the development of this industry, which then later went on to achieve, cost reduction, scale effects, which now have it, in every product we can think of, we find semiconductors. So if we think about how that's evolved since, as venture capital evolved, it was looking for, okay, what is the highest return for that money? And it became clear that as the software industry developed, and this certainly exploded since the internet, it's much easier to make a higher return with software. Why is that? Well, it's digital. My inputs there really are people writing code as opposed to I need to buy raw materials. So I don't have inventory I need to worry about. I don't have capital equipment to scale a factory. And if I am able to achieve what's called a platform, which you think about that Google has done in search or Meta has done with social media, those create outsized returns based on network effects. Mm-hmm. So more valuable the more people who are using it. So in that world, I have much faster time to revenue and profitability with software. It's much lower cost, it's lower risk, and with the platform, I could generate outsized returns. Mm-hmm. So that combination makes software incredibly powerful and attractive for venture capitalists, and it's why estimates are that 90% of the venture today is going into life sciences, biotech, and information communications technology.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful because the U.S. has a comparative advantage globally. No one is better than the U.S. in software, but it means that we're not as balanced when we think about the other technologies that we'd like to also be leading with.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is, let's just take AI, for example. You could say that when it comes to frontier models and the business around that, perhaps that would be, that's something that will easily attract capital. But if you look at the AI stack, as Vice President Vance recently spoke about when he was in Paris, there's chips, there's data centers, there's chips, there's energy. There are different components to this. Especially the chips piece is this hardware-intensive, capital-intensive set of ventures that you're talking about. And so if we have a challenge there with financing, we really can't win the AI race for any sustained period of time, especially when our competitors have the capital that they can crowd into hardware-intensive ventures, and we don't, or at least we're challenged in that regard. Is that fair?
That's very fair, and it's not just AI. You're going to need chips for any of these technologies, the space technology, synthetic bio, quantum. Okay, I'm going to need some different chips there, but the semiconductor technology is fundamental to all of these future technologies, cyber, et cetera.
Let's go back to the point you made around the health of the U.S. innovation system, right? So you've talked about these technologies. You've mentioned this case that you've made quite convincingly about where the focus should be. I'm going to pull up this next chart, which is really the point you made about R&D. If I look at this chart around R&D spend, starting from the 50s till today, it's the point you've made, which is federal R&D is actually diminished relative to its historical levels, at high levels in the 60s. Some of this has been made up, obviously, by business R&D or private sector R&D. There are a couple of points when I look at this chart. One is, I think you're saying that the aggregate level of R&D needs to be much higher overall, given the nature of technology innovation across the different technologies we're talking about. And the second thing is that there's probably a question of the type of R&D that's underneath each of these categories. So if I think of user-inspired versus curiosity-inspired R&D, it's probably different in the federal R&D component here versus the business. But tell me a little bit more about this and whether I have this right.
Oh, Navin, I think you're spot on. So the first point is, right, we should be spending more on basic research, which is really what the government has done, which has declined in the 60s from the 2% level, which you see in kind of the early to mid 1960s, to now 0.6%, where half of that is being spent on health. So think about it from national security. I went from 2% to 0.03%. Then you're right. We have had a completely laissez-faire approach, or let the market decide what technologies we should be investing in. And we had such a lead relative to the rest of the world that has served us well. The lead is much narrower with China, so we probably could apply more thought to what do we want that basic research, the government spending to be on. So not only should we be spending more, but let's give a little more thought to what are the critical technologies that we want to advance. This will be important when we talk about commercialization, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
So how much we're spending and what we're spending money on, and then the business spending in R&D, which has helped make up for this gap, is more focused on commercialization or applied R&D versus basic R&D. That's a good thing, but again, we're letting profit drive where that money is spent versus thinking through, if I'm really trying to ensure widespread adoption of a technology, which will benefit the entire country versus maybe select areas, there could be some more thought spent to how are we going to ensure that technology is widely adopted, maybe by industries that could be lagging, which would improve the overall economy, our total productivity. And productivity is the key to having a economy that is going to be setting the pace for the next few decades. That really is going to be a key. Any economist will tell you a key determinant of the health of your economy and the prosperity of your people.
And just tell us a little bit about where the footprint is of federal R&D. There's some in the DOE, there's some in the DOD. Can you give us the numbers or like the breakdown on where it is, the center of gravity on that?
Yeah, we're spending a few $100 billion on basic R&D, but and a lot of that is, the biggest proportion is the Defense Department, probably followed by DOE. And I think that this is being determined by what we believe would be the highest priorities at the Defense Department versus where does the economy do we see the biggest improvements? For example, fusion. The Defense Department is not spending any money, as far as I know, on fusion development. So I think that if we thought about what are the critical technologies we would like to ensure come to market and maybe ahead of China, and then how could we be more effectively deploying that R&D spending? There's some ideas in the paper you're referring to that talk about an improvement in outcomes-based research, for example, that will help us make sure that we're driving to some key metrics in our research that would allow us to go a little bit faster if we do that, get to outcomes. And then part of the paper is talking about how could we make that attractive to venture so that we can amplify the amount we're spending in government. And that basically means we need to think about how venture firms do their investing, which is about team, how big is the market, and how mature is the technology. And if we had that in mind as a government, then we'd allow both private equity and venture capital to amplify this R&D investment that we're making and ensure it's more widely developed, more widely adopted. That's the part I think we are completely missing. Because we've been on top for so long in terms of innovation, technology development relative to other countries, we haven't really thought about how do we make the basic R&D more attractive for the private sector to develop. And a lot of things have developed organically without having that thought. Well, we're in much more serious competition now with China specifically. And so we need to be thinking, how do we leverage the venture capital, which is the title of this podcast. Well, the way to do that is make that easier for private sector money to come in and see an opportunity as attractive to develop. And that has to do, as I mentioned, for the venture community, thinking about the team, the tech, and how visible is a large market.
Yes. Now tell us more about that, because this is I think that one of the essence of the point that you're making is we're in a large, boisterous democracy and market economy, and we are trying to focus attention around national goals, and you have to do that differently here than you would in an authoritarian kind of setup like the PRC. Tell us your thoughts on and your recommendations on how to use public capital to provide an incentive for the capital markets, for venture capital, to look towards those hardware and capital-intensive industries that you've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about the total R&D for the U.S. that the government is spending, you have, say 200 billion or so. And then the venture capital industry, as a relative in size, is spending 300 billion a year, so more than that, 3 times, in fact, what the Defense Department would spend on R&D. If you add private equity to that, you add a couple $1 trillion that could be spent per year. So a lot more capital available in the private markets. So we should be leveraging that. So as I mentioned, the private markets are not just going to look at the technology license, which has been available from national labs as an example, and say that's worth very much, which is why we don't get very much pull from private markets by offering technology licenses. If the government were to say, here's a team that's interested in developing this technology, that would be a very big factor for the venture community, having that team. Understanding where the tech is, and if it's developed to the point where there's execution required but not invention, is another big attractor for the venture capital market. It might be a bit of a misnomer. People might think venture capital is attracted to risk. It's quite the opposite. Venture capital is trying to mitigate risk. So the less risky technology a venture capitalist can look at, the happier he or she is. So maturity of the technology is another key component. And the third is how visible is the market. For a lot of the technologies that are important for national security, the government is going to be a big customer. Our budgeting system does not work well to think about multi-year appropriations and big programs. Think about the difference between how we might buy weapons systems today, which is year by year. There's no multi-year appropriation compared to what we did with the Apollo program back in the 1960s. We knew the national goal was to get to the moon, and it was pretty certain that the government was going to spend towards those goals. We had some ups and downs during that period from when President Kennedy announced it until we landed on the moon. So it wasn't smooth up and to the right, but there was a consistent level of funding and funding to reach that goal. My point being, if you were a company that was a supplier to the Apollo program, as the semiconductor firms were, you knew that was pretty consistent, and that allowed you to expand your productive capacity, invest in some inventory, the capital equipment, what you'd need to surge capability. That's what's missing today, for example, in our defense industrial base. There's no certainty. There's no view to what's the higher level of spending that might be coming. And those are the economic incentives that make our capitalistic system go. And the more we lean into those, the more we have an advantage relative to China.
You make a really strong point when you share your public capital framework. We're going to pull this up now, where how do we think about the use of public capital in these different ways? Now, you emphasize this part here just now on the role of contracts. I think you said contracts in your paper. And this provides the revenue predictability for companies to be able to make those investments, a very, very strong incentive. And I'm assuming from what you said, significant room for reform in the US government, including the DoD, in terms of how acquisitions are done in a way that prioritizes these hardware-intensive technologies that will shape the future. But let me ask you, there's another piece to it, which is, doesn't government also, when it comes to government equity or government guaranteed loans, doesn't it also need to be able to take bets, and that the public should be well educated and well versed in the nature of how venture works, meaning there will be failures and there will also be successes. Could you share a little bit about your thoughts on that? Because my sense is that in the political environment that we oftentimes find ourselves, it's sometimes hard to translate that point. But help me out with that.
Yeah, well, I think the framework really is saying government has a unique role where it's the riskiest bets. There is definitely scope for the government to make investments. And the riskiest bets, the government needs to develop the technology to the point where its private capital can take it from that point forward. Again, execution versus invention. But for a large majority of technologies that aren't as expensive to develop, that really just need market visibility, and in many cases the government can be a very large customer. I'll give you an example. The Defense Department is the largest consumer of energy in the world. And if you think about it, that makes sense. How many people and equipment we have around the world that needs to move, airplanes, ships, etc. So therefore, the Defense Department could be a huge catalyst for new energy technologies. Yeah. So yes, we could be conserving energy, and there's a lot of activity at DoD to do that. But for developing alternative sources of energy, whether you believe in climate change or not, and I do, it's very important from a resilience standpoint to not be depending on fossil fuels and the huge supply chain problems that creates. So if in fact, DoD were spending there, think about the Apollo program and putting men on the moon the way we were spending to create basically the beginning of what now is a space economy that we have with all the satellite and sensor capability. If we were spending, the government could actually create that market. The same thing is true with the air taxi market, which has military applications. There are quite a few examples of that. The space is another example of that. We're not forward leaning in terms of we're envisioning a space economy the same way we developed the interstate highway system in the 1950s, which had untold economic benefits. We could be doing the same thing in space today. So that's creating a lot of market visibility, which will attract a ton of private capital. So it's really looking for where could the government be a large customer and shape an industry of the future. That's where contracts are the most important ingredient.
Understood.
Because that is, again, the primary tools we have in a capitalistic system. If the technology is riskier, then a government grant can be appropriate. That's where we are with fusion, as an example. The government could help develop that to the point where the technology is more mature, less risky, less invention required. So that's not ready for contracts yet. Right. And in between is the technology may be proven, but we need to scale up a plant. So that's where a loan might be the appropriate tool. So most important is contracts. Right. We could be doing a lot more there with visibility for companies to multi-year spending. We're terrible at that in the government. Again, only very few items have multi-year appropriation. And then really design the right financial tool to support the technology depending on where the risk is. Riskiest would be equity, in between would be the loans, and then where the technology is ready to just be commercialized. But we need people to invest in the productive capacity. That's where the contracts come into play.
The framework is simple, accessible, and powerful for how we can prioritize the uses of public capital. This administration and even the previous administration were talking about a American sovereign wealth fund idea. And that could mean many things to many people, but I'm curious about your thoughts about that idea. I would also add that, Senator Coons and a few others have including potentially, I think at the time, Senator Vance had been working on the idea of a industrial finance corporation, something similar to an instrument that would close the valley of death. What are your thoughts on this, including the relevance of a sovereign wealth fund?
So first of all, on closing the valley of death, I think we already described that really is a matter of reforming the budgeting process. Why does it take 3 years to develop a defense budget and start spending from it? So we don't need a sovereign wealth fund to solve that problem. And sovereign wealth fund would be pretty low on my list of ideas for the simple reason that the financial markets in the US are the deepest and biggest in the world. So capital isn't the issue, it's incentives. So I think as it relates to incentives, we already talked a bit about how the government could be more effective in thinking through what am I going to do to incentivize the riskiest technology. I may need to look at where do I need to demonstrate technology maturity versus where do I need to incentivize expansion in productive capacity, like in the defense industrial base. Yeah. So I would rather see that government investment back into R&D, as we talked about earlier in this podcast. Yeah. That's where the real need is, to make sure we're preeminent in science and technology. And then do we have the right incentives in place so that when we have a breakthrough, a discovery, can we commercialize that and ensure that's adopted more widely throughout the economy? So I'd rather see that same money spent there. And we talked about earlier, what are the incentives that would attract private capital? If we work on the incentives piece with plenty of capital ready to put to work in the U.S. I think that the most important, highest goal for us is to make sure we're leading in science and technology. I don't hear that as a national goal, but it would certainly be on the top of my list. It's what's ensured our prosperity. It's what's made the venture capital industry, which doesn't do the invention, it just is in the commercialization business. That will ensure we have prosperity for the next couple of decades. We're seeing the prosperity we enjoy today because of the investments we made decades before. Yeah.
It's a strong point. I want to just pick up a thread on private capital because that point really strongly resonates with me. And one of the things I've been seeing among folks in the private sector is the evolution of indices that prioritize national security or patriotic investing, right? So just to take the analogy with ESG, there was a long period where the idea was let's attract those investors that have not only financial goals, but non-financial goals related to environment, social, and governance investing. Is there an analogy today for national security investing, patriotic capital, competitiveness investing, all the things we've been talking about, critical and emerging technology investing, where we could say we have a set of investors that clearly have financial goals, but they also are interested in our national security? And you'll see a number of indices out there, ETFs, that are being done in this way. These are obviously in the public market, so not the illiquid markets like venture or private equity. But I wanted to get your perspective. You've seen this for so many years. I wanted to get your perspective on how relevant are these things? How promising is that as an approach? And is that something you would encourage?
I think it's a good approach because you're creating some visibility for the needs that we have, certainly from the national security standpoint. But I would rather see our energy focused on creating longer-term incentives.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues we have with our capitalistic system is it's very short-term focused. The economic theory that we're operating under, which led to globalization and Milton Friedman's school of thought, the shareholder revolution, really comes from an understanding of operating in the world without competitors. So free market system, everyone believes in what we believe in. Global trade is good. And those things are true in an environment where I don't have an adversary who might be coercive and withhold inputs from me.
Yeah.
So we don't have an economic theory that really accounts for that, which has led to some of the situation we're in today.
Right.
Our profit-seeking behavior has led to supply chain problems because our economic theory says everyone's our friend and no one would ever think about being coercive in operating their economy. Well, the Chinese have shown us there's a different way, and it's not consistent with that type of thinking. So I think one of the most productive things we could do with our market-based system is think about how to take those very short-term incentives. If you think about the capital markets rewarding companies for every last penny per share per quarter, and I know this firsthand from being a CEO, if there were more incentive to invest more for the longer term, invest in R&D, there's no incentive for companies to invest in long-term R&D because the markets will crucify them for that and expect, why are you not taking that spending and giving me more cash flow near term? That's how our defense companies are rewarded today. Cash flow near term, which investors expect to be plowed back into share buybacks.
Yeah.
That's not investing in the long-term productive capacity of the company. So I would love to see some emphasis on, our capital gain system now. 1 year qualifies you as long-term capital gains. I don't know who thinks 1 year is a long-term investment horizon. Probably no one. So let's think about, we could have a graduated system that rewards people for investing in 5-year, 10-year projects.
Yeah.
That's where we need to rethink our system because China has a very long-term perspective on investment. They're thinking about where's their economy going to be in 2049, 100 years after the PRC, had effective control of the country. And so they have investment priorities that are 10, 20, 30 years in length. What have we had in the U.S. that has anything close to that since the first space program? Yeah. So we need to be thinking longer term. We need to be encouraging our companies to think longer terms and making investments in our future.
Excellent point. And I want to pick up a thread there around how global markets used to operate and then the recognition that we have a major competitor in the value chains, in the global markets that operates according to mercantilist and sometimes malign objectives or pursues them. And so the notion that we could simply operate in a globalized economy and just compete as firms in the marketplace is something that we can't accept as a given anymore. But there's also a tendency to overcorrect, which is that folks, I think, are veering towards what some would say is protectionism, a fear of navigating the global markets. You, in your paper, make an argument that I think is really quite interesting, and I think people should pay attention to it, which is the notion that we do need to trade. Technology value chains are global in nature. So let's develop a global trading bloc or a trading bloc with allies or those that are aligned with us, market economies, as a way to really respond to what is in effect a mercantilist threat. Tell us a little bit more about your idea here, because I think it deserves a lot more attention. It's a really important one.
Well, thanks, Navin. Yeah, I believe strongly that free trade is part of how we will compete and, frankly, prevail in a global competition. Just because we have one large player in China who has a very different perspective, a mercantilistic viewpoint, which is trade means we win, you lose, and is coercive, meaning withholding, raw inputs for others. Rare earths would be an example of that. Cutting off, supplies of many things that they might see other economies needing if it serves their political interests. So just because we have that player doesn't mean that we can't get the benefits of a free and open trading economy with our friends and allies. So yeah, rather than retreat and be focused on just what we can do within our own borders, I think we can have a much bigger impact by collaborating with our allies and partners around the world. The GDP of U.S. allies and partners, of course, the asymmetric strength that we have is we have allies and partners relative to China, which only has Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I'd much rather be in our club than theirs. Is that the productive output, the GDP of those combined countries is 3 to 4x what China's is. So that's a way to make sure that we have a very productive economy, and you could isolate or contain China. You could influence their bad behavior by not providing them access to that much larger market. That requires a little more coordination with allies and partners. It requires strengthening that relationship. Maybe there's opportunity to do combined R&D, as an example, as we're starting to do with the AUKUS partners, that you could envision that being even broader. But from a trade perspective, rather than thinking about imposing tariffs on our allies and partners, we should be thinking about how to increase the economic integration across those economies and using that as a strength relative to countries that's behaving, poorly and in an adversarial way, which China's doing.
This is a great insight, and I think hopefully bringing the technology competition perspective to questions around trade policy, I hope will allow us to prioritize where do we use tariffs, where does it make sense, where does it not make sense. I think we're obviously in the early days right now of a new tariff agenda with the Trump 2.0 agenda, and I think it's worth having that criteria of does it help us innovate faster, better, and bigger, which is what we started out with. When you look at tariffs, when you look at strategic capital, when you look at any number of these policies. You have really helped us.
We have to get away from the trade deficit being the single measure of success.
Yeah.
You can imagine the trade deficit non-existing, and we have imbalanced trade with China, but we're supplying timber, coal, other raw materials, and they're sending to us electronics, manufactured goods of high value. The trade deficit could be zero, but that's a horrible situation for the U.S. to find itself in. Equivalent to that joke from the, I think it was a Bush administration, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? There's a hell of a difference in terms of where your economy is headed and what your capacity is. And the person that said that now disowns the comment because they realize in hindsight it wasn't smart. But we need to be thinking about how do we use trade to improve our technology position relative to China and our economic prosperity relative to China. And our trading partners can have a big role in doing that. If we seal ourselves off, we're not going to be achieving that. We have tremendous strengths within our country, but you're not going to benefit from all the brain power, ideas, capital, and prosperity we get from trading with allies and partners.
Mike, you've helped us really think through very, very complex issues, but also very urgent and pressing ones. Really, I want to end the way I started. Your work has been a source of great inspiration for me and for many others, and thank you for continuing to keep us focused. And we hope that you'll come back and join us as you do more writing and more thinking on these topics. But really, I really appreciate your time today.
Well, love to come back, and thank you so much for the opportunity, Navin.
Thank you for joining this illuminating conversation with Mike Brown. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more on csis.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the tech race.
If we thought about what are the critical technologies we would like to ensure come to market and maybe ahead of China, and then how could we be more effectively deploying that R&D spending? There's some ideas in the paper you're referring to that talk about an improvement in outcomes-based research, for example, that will help us make sure that we're driving to some key metrics in our research that would allow us to go a little bit faster if we do that, get to outcomes. And then part of the paper is talking about how could we make that attractive to venture so that we can amplify the amount we're spending in government. And that basically means we need to think about how venture firms do their investing, which is about team, how big is the market, and how mature is the technology. And if we had that in mind as a government, then we'd allow both private equity and venture capital to amplify this R&D investment that we're making and ensure it's more widely developed, more widely adopted. That's the part I think we are completely missing. Because we've been on top for so long in terms of innovation, technology development relative to other countries, we haven't really thought about how do we make the basic R&D more attractive for the private sector to develop.
We do need to trade. Technology value chains are global in nature. So let's develop a global trading bloc or a trading bloc with allies or those that are aligned with us, market economies, as a way to really respond to what is an effective mercantilist threat. Tell us a little bit more about your idea here, because I think it deserves a lot more attention. It's a really important one.
Well, thanks, Navin. Yeah, I believe strongly that free trade is part of how we will compete and, frankly, prevail in a global competition. Just because we have one large player in China who has a very different perspective, a mercantilistic viewpoint, which is trade means we win, you lose, and is coercive, meaning withholding, raw inputs for others. Rare earths would be an example of that, cutting off, supplies of many things that they might see other economies needing if it serves their political interests. So just because we have that player doesn't mean that we can't get the benefits of a free and open trading economy with our friends and allies.
We are now in the age of biology. How will the biotech revolution change our economy and society? What is its potential for transforming warfighting and national security? Is the United States prepared to seize the pole position? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, and today we speak with the Vice Chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, Dr. Michelle Rosa. Dr. Rosa, we are delighted to have you here in our studios for Betting on America podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
You are the Vice Chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, and the Commission just released a comprehensive report to Congress, and something that's based on 2 years of research and consultation. Before we get into the key messages of the report, can you tell us what the Commission is, why does it exist, and why is its work both timely and important?
Of course, happy to do so. First of all, thank you again, Navin, for having me here. It's an honor to be here, and it's really exciting to finally be able to share what we've been working on for the last 2 years. But as you say, before we get into the meat of it, let's do a little bit about what we are and who the Commission is. So you can think of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech as a legislative advisory council. We are a group of subject matter experts, of former government officials, and a bipartisan and bicameral group of elected members of Congress who Congress asked to advise them about the intersection of national security and emerging biotechnology. We were created by a National Defense Authorization Act, and we were asked to look at how emerging biotechnology would impact the future of defense and national security and make legislative recommendations back to Congress. I want to pause a minute on our members of Congress because I think it's so important that we had elected officials serving with us for the last 2 years. As I say, it was a bipartisan, bicameral group. We have 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 2 senators, 2 members of the House of Representatives. Our chair is Senator Todd Young, who I know was on your podcast just a little bit ago. He spoke about a number of topics, but touched on biotechnology and the Commission work. It was a great episode. And the importance of having members on our Commission was twofold. First was that they were able to work with us and road test our options and policies in such a way that they would work for bipartisan members of Congress. So what you will see that we've come out with is something that's immediately actionable. The second is that they focused us on legislation. And so we are really oriented towards Congress and what Congress can do for emerging biotechnology and national security. The last thing I'll say of why now is that biotechnology is going to have enormous impact across national security. And this means traditional defense, but also economic security, food security, health security. And we are coming up to this inflection point of the technology. And so Congress had asked us to do this work by design in advance of this coming ChatGPT moment, if you will, for biotech, so that it could be prepared to take the pole position, as you said in your intro.
Oh, that's a great overview and a good segue to my next question, because I'm a lay person, like a lot of lay people who don't understand exactly what biotechnology means. And could you help us? What is biotechnology?
Yeah.
What are the components of it? Why is it important? How does it flow through to our economy?
Of course. So biotech is simply directing biology to specific outcomes, to build new products, new processes. It is by no means new. We as humans have been leveraging biology for thousands of years. And you just have to look into your refrigerator to see the outputs of that. Think of things that are made by fermentation, which is a term that I think people are familiar with. Cheese, wine, yogurt, beer, right? And if you think about brewing beer, you give a yeast sugar and it converts that into alcohol, right? And so we've been leveraging biotechnology since the dawn of humanity. With modern biotechnology, it's been around for about 50 years. You can think about actually editing organisms, directing them more specifically towards directed outcomes. And recombinant insulin, for example, was one of the first products on the market that was done with the sort of modern biotechnology in the early 1980s. But what we are coming towards now is this inflection point, this intersection of really advanced engineering biology tools. You may have heard of CRISPR, along with automation to standardize and accelerate the experimentation process, and artificial intelligence, which of course underlies automation, but can now be used to really probe deeper into biology, which is very complex. It's been hard to direct biology to what we want it to do, and start to streamline that in our understanding of the technology. So let me give you an example of this. We know ChatGPT, right? This has now exploded on our consciousness. We've been able to train foundation models like these large language models on the corpus of information on the internet, text, imagery, and now we can probe ChatGPT and ask questions. Many of us use it in our day-to-day lives. The same thing is happening in biology. So we can train foundation models on biological language, the A's and C's and T's and G's that make up the genetic code, or the images of protein structures, which underlie how they function. And in doing so, scientists can now more exquisitely be able to ask a foundation model, design me a biological system that can perform this function, like a drug function, and accelerate this design, build, test, learn cycle, and really transform biology into an engineering discipline. So that is what we are on the cusp of. This is what the inflection point is, and when it arrives, it will impact every aspect of our economy, everything from medicine to food to agriculture to industry and defense.
Profound change. I think your report says biology is evolving from a field of discovery to a field of design.
That's right.
And I think you kind of bringing biology and biotech and AI together, it's kind of an accelerant to this, if I understand it correctly.
That's right. That's right. It's because biology has been, as I said before, increasingly complex. You're working with living systems and parts of that. And so it's hard to direct it to where you want it to go. With artificial intelligence, we can begin to make sense of what is really complex information and help use these computational tools to sift through large amounts of information and help make sense of that for scientists.
So that's mind-blowing in terms of its possibilities and opportunities, new ways of, new products, new ways of addressing health and different aspects of human life, agri-tech, so on and so forth, but also lots of risks.
Yeah, so biotechnology, like all technologies, are not inherently good or bad, right? It really depends on how it is used, how it is developed, deployed, and the ultimate output of that technology. We lay out in the report the enormous good that can come from biotechnology if it's used in the right way and with our values to build, to help, to feed, to defend. But then if it is imbued with other values, how it could be used to do the opposite of that in really profound and serious ways to attack, to destroy, to harm. And so it really matters that the United States is at the forefront of this technology to imbue our values and the way that we want this technology to ultimately benefit Americans to come forward and be the ultimate output of biotech. One of the aspects that I think is really exciting about how biotechnology can impact our national security is thinking about our supply chain and the supply chain vulnerabilities we have today. So I like to walk through two examples here, both of how biotechnology can provide drop-in replacements for things that are in our system today, and then talk about new capabilities. So if you allow me a bit more of some explanations. So trade analysts have estimated that the amount of the inputs to our economy that could be made with biology is at 60%. So think about everything that goes into our economy today, most of which are not biological, things like plastics and chemicals and materials. 60% of that could be made instead with biology. So if we go back to our beer example, which I like to use, we can now edit the yeast organism or the biological organism using genetic tools and our artificial intelligence to help us design that, as we just described, and convert that metabolic pathway so it takes in sugar or other raw materials and transforms that instead to a chemical or material that we can use in our system. BCG does a great overview of this in a publication called Synthetic Biology is Disrupting Your Manufacturing. And they give an anecdote around one chemical called 1,4-butanediol, which probably no one has ever heard of. There's no reason to have heard of it. But you probably interact with it on a daily basis because it is an intermediate chemical that goes into polyurethane, which is in like spandex and in the lining in your automobiles. And this in 2020 was a $5 billion industry. The traditional manufacturing facilities for 1,4-butanediol or BDO, there's 5 of them, the main ones. 3 are in China, 2 are in Xinjiang. So there's implications for that. This report goes on to describe how U.S. companies are innovating around making bio-based BDO, so doing that same sort of editing that we described to make an organism convert sugar and raw materials in the United States into a bio-based BDO and building a full-scale facility to do this manufacturing in Iowa. So double-clicking on that for a minute, that looks like taking a supply chain that right now goes through China, right, bringing that to the United States. And it's not just onshoring or reshoring existing legacy manufacturing.
Yeah.
It is actually creating entirely new manufacturing. This is such a key thing because we offshore this manufacturing in many ways for reasons, right? And this enables us to bring back, good manufacturing jobs, new manufacturing jobs that are sustainable, that, look like brewing beer, right? If you think about,
Right.
what that looks like in your communities. Now, instead of just beer, you can brew chemicals and materials and the things that are necessary for the U.S. and its supply chain. So it's a really transformative potential for our economic and national
Let me
security.
just pause there because really it's important to reflect on this for a second.
Yeah.
One is that, coming into this, I would think of the biotech value chain and the dependencies that we have with respect to other countries.
Mm-hmm.
What you're describing is biotechnology allowing us to overcome those dependencies.
That's right.
While at the same time generating jobs at home.
That's right.
So it's like a double win.
Mm-hmm.
This is very, very interesting. So I just wanted to hang on that for a second. That's important.
I agree. And I think when people think about it, they think about overcoming existing vulnerabilities in like our medical supply chain, of which there are many. We are dependent on China for the raw ingredients in our medicines that make up the medicines in your drug cabinet, for example. But biotech can help with other supply chain dependencies as well. The other example I like to give is rare earth elements, which we're all talking about today in Washington and across the country, right? Because they're critical for semiconductors, our cell phones, cars, our weapon systems. And we have real dependencies on this, again, as your audience will well know. Biotech can solve for this. So there are existing deposits here in the United States where there are rare earth elements that we can't get out because the mining deposits are too complex. Right. So our existing technologies don't allow us to separate those effectively. And then we have rare earth elements in electronics. So I don't have my phone with me, but of course there's rare earth elements there. Once once I'm done with it, you could recycle that and get some of the rare earth elements out of there. But again, that's really complex to do with existing technologies. It's not efficient enough to make it useful for full-scale production. Biotech companies are innovating around this problem set right now and designing biology, proteins, microbes that can efficiently bind to and extract specific rare earth elements from mining deposits, from e-waste, thereby opening up potentially new sources of rare earth elements here in America.
Wow, very eye-opening. And, we, in our department, we spend a lot of time focusing on economic security. And for good reason, it ends up focusing on protecting our assets and our markets. What you're describing also is how innovation is the enduring source of economic security going forward. Innovation in biotechnology, in the different areas you mentioned, and how that bleeds through or flows through to different sectors.
That's right.
Very, very interesting point. Okay, so I want to talk about national security for a moment. Help us understand what this means for defense, what this means for our war fighters, because that's also an important application.
Of course, and this gets really to the heart of our work because we are, at our core, we are looking at biotechnology for defense and national security. And similarly, as I described the potential for supply chain security, biotechnology will be a game changer for the major problems facing our military today. You can think about logistics on demand, secure supply chains, operational readiness, and military medicine. And I like to give a couple, again, examples here. So we just talked about how we can, using the beer analogy, how we can bring supply chains back home to America. Those could be things like the chemicals that make up the materials in our clothes or our automobiles, help us with rare earth elements, but it could also be the starting materials for the Defense Department. And the Defense Department, like the United States, have sole source or foreign source for major components of the supply chain, right? And so the DoD right now is innovating around and working with industry to develop biomanufactured routes of production of critical chemicals and components that make up the DoD supply chain. So that could be here in America, but it could also be forward deployed to solve for logistics on demand. So I'm going to keep stretching this beer analogy, if you will. But if you can think
Which
about...
I'm sure some people will appreciate.
Yeah, right. If you can think about, you can brew beer in a massive, major facility. You can do it in your community, but you can also do it at home. And as this was something in graduate school. I don't know what it is about scientists and brewing beer, but a lot of my friends in graduate school were home brewers, and so they had their equipment at home and were making all these different kinds of brews, right? The same analogy goes true for the Department of Defense and National Security, where you can brew these chemicals here in America, but you can also forward deploy them and have these manufacturing small forward deployable facilities on a boat or at an operating base.
Wow.
And so you can solve for logistics on demand,
Yeah.
making the things that our service members need where they need it.
Yes.
This is not science fiction. This is under development today. And again, this is everything from medicines to foods to materials to chemicals that make up the raw supply chain. And this can greatly solve for some of the issues that our military is struggling with today when you think about having to be so many places and project power in many hemispheres across the world. Another example, so this is, thinking about new capabilities.
So just sorry,
Yeah.
you're de facto shortening the supply chain.
That's right. Shortening
it's
the
like
supply
in
chain.
real time.
That's right. In real time.
Tremendous. Yeah.
And removing the need, which is dangerous for our service members to have to do resupply and supply missions, right?
Yeah.
To move supplies
Yes.
from bases into front lines. Like that is an enormous source of potential conflict and issues for our service members. So it also helps protect them. You don't have to do that in the future anymore. You can actually make the things where you need them
Okay.
in the theater, in the field. Really game-changing
very
potential.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah.
Another example that I like to show here, this is, and I have a prop. So for those
Yes,
listening online,
I'm looking forward to this,
I'll try to
yes.
describe it, but maybe this is for those who want to jump on YouTube to see this. Okay, so the golden hour is the critical time period following trauma during which treatment significantly improves patient chance of survival. And one of the things that greatly improves chance of survival is access to blood and blood products. But as you can imagine, blood is not always available in combat environments, right? Or in remote areas of the United States. As we know, blood is always in short supply. It needs to be cold and refrigerated and blood typed and all of this stuff, very complicated. And so that's not always available in combat environments. So with this technology that's under deployment at DARPA, and what I'm holding up is two bags, one that has a demo of hemoglobin and another freeze-dried plasma. You could essentially crack these like glow sticks,
Yeah.
move the dried material into the liquid,
Wow.
and be able to make a field deployable blood,
Wow.
thereby potentially turning the golden hour into a golden day.
Amazing.
Like, amazing. Save lives on
And
the
is
front
this
lines.
is this already being used right now?
No, this is under development at DARPA, so this is a prop for purposes for today.
But so we have a good insight into what may be coming.
That's right, exactly.
Fantastic. Thank you for bringing that prop.
And thank you to DARPA for letting us show this off. I mean, really exciting capabilities. But what you'll see is that a lot of this needs to move forward from research and innovation into commercialization.
Right.
It needs to be forward deployed. There are some technical limitations, but there's also challenges with just the strategic direction from the United States and prioritization.
Yeah.
And so we have recommendations that help to address all of those and really
Yes,
get these technologies.
I want to come to this because it's a huge point. But before we do that,
Yes.
you ring the alarm in this report about the competition from China.
Yeah.
And you do it in a way that, it really was eye-opening for me, which is we're kind of at this point where, if I understand it correctly, and I want you to describe it in your own words, that they are about to lock in their advantage. And there's a window for us to really make sure that we stay ahead in life sciences and biotechnology. Explain that to us, because this was a big part of this report.
Yeah. And it was one of our most critical findings. So what we'll say is we have, and what we've found is that we have a 3-year window for action, absence which we feel as though China will gain the leading edge and this will be impossible to regain. Because we're waiting for this ChatGPT moment, this inflection point, that when it arrives will create economic, geopolitical, national security leverage, the ability to really move biology to all of these applications, that will create this moat so large that it'll be very difficult to overcome. And while we're waiting for this ChatGPT moment that is rapidly advancing, what we are seeing is a DeepSeek moment occurring in China. And what I mean by that is that China is starting to out-innovate us.
Wow.
In biotechnology and do so faster and cheaper, particularly in pharmaceuticals. And I look at some of the data that I have on my sheet here to really detail this point. But 20 years ago, the CCP made biotech a strategic priority. And we're seeing the results show here. So these are drugs that are coming through and being approved by the FDA that come from Chinese biotech. You see large multinational pharmaceutical companies seeking out Chinese biotech for innovative licensing and IP deals. the global share of Chinese pharmaceutical output increased from just 5% in 2002 to 25% in 2019. And the market value over 5 years from 2016 to 2021 grew 100-fold to $300 billion.
Yeah.
So you're really seeing not just fast following, which is what we tend to talk about when it comes to the CCP and technology areas, but out innovating the United States in pharmaceuticals. And what's right now happening in pharma could be soon coming in the other sectors that biotechnology applies to. So when you look at agriculture, China's now outspending the U.S. and the EU when it comes to R&D
on
agriculture.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in 2019, for the first time, China applied for more international patents, and many of these were with CRISPR and agriculture. So again, thinking of this leading edge genetic editing technique in agriculture. But this can also be coming in industry and defense. If you just go back to publications in synthetic biology, in 2010, researchers in the US published 45% of the world's most highly cited papers, Chinese researchers just 13. Now this is flipped by 2023. Chinese researchers published 60% of the most cited papers, US just 7.
So the quantity and quality of research is accelerating.
Yes, that is correct. And so what you're really seeing is the strategic direction by the CCP is paying dividends, and Chinese biotech is out innovating us, and again, in many ways can do so cheaper and faster because of their system. And conversely, the US approach has been piecemeal. Up to this date has not been coordinated and done so at a high level. We have not made biotechnology a strategic priority. Our report and our recommendations to Congress aim to change that and lay out a roadmap to ensure that we can remain at the leading edge of this critical technology.
Wow. And so let me just try and understand this. If I think of the sources of competitive advantage for the Chinese, you talked about research, you talk about lab to market, the ability to scale. What are the other ingredients of their competitive advantage in biotech?
Yeah, so the strategic direction, the top-down support that they have for biotechnology means that you can move all of the products or the compelling research from the lab to a variety of applications.
Right.
Here in the United States, we have history of innovation. Our R&D ecosystem is one of the best in the world. And really, modern biotechnology is a U.S. invention. Our market is really second to none, and we have the best place to innovate and do biotech.
Right.
We have a well-established investor group that focuses on biotechnology for therapeutics, but there is less of an attention and a focus to biotechnology for all of the other applications that we've discussed: agriculture, energy, industry, some of the really novel defense applications, right? Yes. Of where there's still high risk and where the market, return is uncertain or less defined. China doesn't have those same problems, right? Because of their strategic direction and top-down control, they can direct biotechnology to a variety of different applications and products. And so in that way, they are able to move biotechnology in a variety of different directions.
And yet you say something that it struck a chord with me, which is don't try to out-China China.
That's right.
So tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah. So we've just described how China is using vast amounts of government funding and this sort of brute force economic tactics in order to move biotechnology and propel their industry forward.
Yeah.
We should not attempt to do that. That is not the U.S. system. That is not what we do. And so we're recommending a small, targeted spend in very strategic, focused areas on behalf of the U.S. government to unlock the full weight of the private sector and bring that to bear to biotechnology. So I just went through and described, some of the limitations in our existing system with targeted actions by the U.S. government to make, for example, the U.S. government a better customer of biotechnology, to streamline regulation for some of the products coming for ag or industry or defense, to support manufacturing and pre-commercial manufacturing facilities. We can change that risk-reward calculus for the private sector, take on some of the risk on behalf of the government, and really unleash the private capital in the U.S. in full support of biotechnology for a variety of applications. So that's the American way to do this, and that's the type of recommendations that we recommend in our work.
Playing to our strengths.
That's exactly right.
Okay, great. So you take inspiration from the semiconductor experience and what we've done with CHIPS and Science Act and other measures in the last few years. And do you see the same type of toolkit at play with biotech? You mentioned strategic capital, but there are other elements of it as well.
Yeah.
Right?
We have learned, I think, through the last few years, a variety of different ways that we can think about promoting and protecting our technology advantage, right? And we can learn from those lessons to apply them to biotech. But biotech looks very different. It is a unique technology. It is very diffuse, diverse. As I mentioned, we're not yet at that leading edge. So it looks different from semiconductors. But we're seeing some of the same trends. So when we think about semiconductors, we had a history of that manufacturing moving offshore, right? And we're seeing the same trends happen in biotechnology already, where we're having U.S. companies where the innovation is here in the United States, but U.S. companies are looking internationally to do their manufacturing.
Right.
Because accessible facilities for early stage scale up don't exist here in the United States, but they exist in Europe, they exist in Asia, and so our companies are forced to go abroad when they would rather do their manufacturing here in the United States. We aim to change that, and we have recommendations around creating pre-commercial, accessible infrastructure that companies and startups can prototype and pilot their manufacturing processes and be able to show their investors that this is working, and thereby, again, play to our strengths, to our market, and move these capabilities forward. But the trends that we saw in these other industries, we are seeing again in biotechnology. So, everything that is repeating, right? And it's not new. We're seeing this again. We're seeing it again in the Chinese playbook of how they are trying to access U.S. IP and information. It is all the similar tactics and tools coming back around again, and it's just not a one-size-fits-all approach in how we think about applying them to biotechnology.
Yeah. Let me make sure I understand this correctly.
Yeah.
Is that you're providing the basis, for example, through a tech hub for companies to be able to be involved, undertake research, test what could be commercial applications, but the sort of sunk costs early on of doing that are absorbed in a sense by policy.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So two things are at play here. One, we are still kind of accelerating the what biotechnology and biomanufacturing ultimately should look like. So if you think about, again, back to our brewing beer analogy, you're going through different phases, different sizes of scale up throughout manufacturing. So you start small and then you repeat it at a larger scale and then a larger scale till you get till commercialization. That's a really expensive, CapEx heavy process to have that much steel in the ground. And so we are innovating right now in new ways of doing this manufacturing and continuous manufacturing, flexible manufacturing, more standardization. Right now, that's all bespoke for different products. So we have a series of recommendations around focused research challenges for biomanufacturing that really unlock this next paradigm shift of how we can do this type of manufacturing so we can forward deploy it and get it where it's needed. At the same time, as you describe, companies today need access to infrastructure, and they're having to spend their own capital to do that by the government supporting this pre-commercial facilities that are accessible and enable companies to come in and pilot their manufacturing processes and work. One of the critical things here of how this has worked in other areas is that they get access to really specialized trained workforce, people that are skilled in biomanufacturing and are able to help them optimize their processes and get this off the ground to be able to show that it's working and delivering product that, again, this is what investors want to see to be able to move to next stage of development and put additional funding into those companies.
All of these are different elements of an ecosystem that you're describing that we need and that we should invest in a way that plays to our strengths. I was going to ask you about the workforce piece. Maybe you could mention your recommendations and your thoughts on that, because it seems a non-trivial amount of effort that we need to make sure we have a world-class workforce for biotech.
Exactly. And this is an area that was of deep focus to us. We are not prepared to meet the broader needs in workforce. And biotechnology talent and the demand for it has grown almost exponentially in the last 5 years. Demand for computational and AI-driven biotech jobs has grown by 140% between 2018 and 2024. And the demand has not the supply has not kept up with demand. And so we're not producing enough students. The number of masters and PhDs is only about half of what's needed in the industry. But we don't need just masters and PhD students. We need the manufacturers, to really power this explosion of growth in what will be the next wave of an industrial revolution and how we make products here in the United States. So if you look at how much demand there is coming and the workforce we have, we're really just scratching the surface in what is possible. So we have a series of recommendations for how to look at, and I should say there's another aspect of this too, which gets back to the U.S. not prioritizing this sufficiently in the past, which is we need a bioliterate government. And this is the term that we're using of bioliteracy to understand, the components of biotechnology and be able to make policy decisions that support that future workforce and support, this entire ecosystem as you described. So we have a series of recommendations of how to increase the bioliteracy of the U.S. government, ensure that we have policymakers, relevant officials at departments and agencies that are at a senior enough level and that have expertise in biology and biotechnology to be able to make these decisions, and then recommendations that deal with how we grow the talent across the United States for manufacturing jobs, for the really high demand that is here and that is coming for what is, an explosion of potential jobs across America.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize this because it's one of my favorite things, and I think one of the best things about biotechnology is that it's not just segregated to the coasts, right? This is not a technology that exists in only pockets of the country with only people with specialized expertise. Biotechnology and biomanufacturing is really for everyone. Potential is across the country. And so when you think about biomanufacturing and what we're seeing facilities, they're being built in the Midwest next to farmers and cornfields, and is able to pull in the surplus agriculture from those fields and use that at the starting material to biomanufacturing. And so you see jobs all across America. It's not just the corn, in Iowa or Indiana. It can be the raw material in Washington and Florida and Kentucky. That's also, an engineering challenge, what we call flexible feedstocks. And we have recommendations there too to really unlock this potential across all of the United States.
This is such a huge point. I just want to spend a second on this because, when you think about, say, the tech hubs agenda under the CHIPS and Science Act, kind of the concept there is that there are these opportunities with advanced technologies that are geographically dispersed. And, we're coming on the tail end of 40, 50 years of what President Trump and President Biden and now President Trump again have said are people and places left behind. And you're showing through this report and through this work that biotechnology opens up opportunities all across the country in different geographies and in different sectors. And this is quite interesting, and this is why I think we got to educate ourselves about what you're saying here.
I couldn't agree more. And again, it speaks to why I'm so passionate, and I think our fellow commissioners are so passionate about this, is because the potential for job creation all across America. This is something that is accessible. You don't, again, I want to emphasize, you don't need a PhD to fill these roles. These are jobs, good manufacturing jobs that will exist across the country from coast to coast in those communities that have been left behind.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm just going to run down here this all the keys on the keyboard. You talked about strategic capital, public R&D?
Yes.
So say something about that for a second.
Yeah, this has been a historic strength in the U.S. is our support for R&D, and it's really created the ecosystem that we enjoy today. So you look at many of the leading biotech companies, they have been recipients of non-dilutive funding from the government, whether that's SBIR-SITR grants, America's Seed Fund, if you will, NSF, NIH, DOD, and we show an example of amazing research coming out of DARPA. And this has really spearheaded this emerging biotech ecosystem, not just in the United States, but in the world, because again, modern biotech is a U.S. invention. So it's coming from, expertise in the United States and with allies and partners as well. We need to capitalize on those strengths, and we recommend, as I've detailed, grand research challenges that we asked one of our commissioners, who's a leading scientist, to think of the hardest problems in biology, that if we solved them here in America, it would unleash this potential for the economy, for manufacturing. And we lay out a series of grand research challenges in both how we make biology really that true engineering discipline, and then how we make it manufacturable. and how we do that all across the coast. So we have laid out, those elements in our report and recommend that we engage in this sort of grand research challenges across America.
Research, strategic capital, workforce, place-based investments. This is like a lot for us to think about in terms of the toolkit, but it actually reflects what I would say is the modern economic security toolkit for the United States. And biotech is emblematic of that.
That's
from
right.
what you're saying.
That's right.
One more thing that you mentioned, and I just wanted to ask your thoughts on
Sure.
this, is the need to defend. And that's export controls,
That's right.
investment screening, those
right.
types of protect tools.
Yes.
How do you see those playing out when it comes to biotech?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we have a series of recommendations around the protect tools, and we really have a two-phased approach. It's both run faster and slow China down, particularly where there's the potential for misuse and leveraging biotech for national security applications that would harm the United States, right? And so we recommend export controls and modernization to investment screening to be able to address the vulnerabilities that we're seeing, data security measures to protect American sensitive data, biological sensitive data. But critically, as kind of getting back to the semiconductor example, we can't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach for these tools. And I think the export controls are a good one to spend a little bit more time on because we're familiar with the export controls and how they've been used for semiconductors and what is really some of the probably most exquisite manufacturing equipment in the world, right? And that exist in only a couple places around the world with the leading manufacturers. And so the ability to do targeted controls on these really precise choke points have the potential to create a large window of opportunity to prevent weaponization of semiconductors by adversaries. Biotech, conversely, looks very different, right? It is diffuse, it is diverse, and we're not yet at that leading edge. So all of the key components of how we engineer biology, the equipment around that, we're still accelerating those equipment. We're not yet at the EUV level of equipment, right? And so we're still innovating around how we do all of the fundamental components of biotechnology faster and cheaper and better, right, and more exquisitely. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use export controls. It just means we have to have a different philosophy for how to use them. We have to be both more aggressive, but also more nimble. And so be able to put them on, but then take them off when they're no longer representing a choke point. And so we lay out the philosophy to do that. And really that will depend on industry working with the government proactively, helping identify what is actually controllable, and then partners and allies, being able to do that in concert so that we can ensure that this technology, remains in the hands of those that want to use it for immense good, as opposed to those that could use it for immense bad.
Yeah, it's a great distinction, just understanding where the field is relative to, say, semiconductors, and that then changes the mix of instruments, or at least how much you weigh on one instrument versus another. Right. It's nuanced, it's important, and it kind of goes back to your point of having a bioliterate government.
That's right.
Meaning, we need to understand this, we need to understand the field better to be able to institute those policies. So that's a great point. We are in an era of universal and reciprocal tariffs, and I wanted to raise this because you mentioned about how biotechnology can help us resolve supply chain constraints. But biotechnology in the various areas you mentioned are also part of global value chains. And so trading partners are important. And you mentioned choke points. How should we think about our ability to out-innovate the Chinese, our ability to stay on the cold face of this technology in a world in which there are, let's just say, a higher level of trade barriers and maybe potentially ongoing, I don't want to say trade war, but at least trade conflicts that's the era we're in.
Sure. So we have a series of recommendations around working with partners and allies to remain at the leading edge of biotechnology. It is, as we've just been talking about, it's so diffuse, it's so varied. We can't get there alone. And critically, this is not partnering for partnering's sake. It is because there are really inherent strengths across the international community, across our partners and allies when it comes to biotechnology. As commissioners, we visited 14 countries across 5 continents while we were going across our work to really identify where pockets of excellence were across our partners and allied ecosystem. For example, we talked a lot about biomanufacturing and how those flexible facilities don't exist here in the United States. Well, we visited an example of one of those in Belgium with Bio-Based Europe. And so we were able to take that concept and bring it back to the United States. But it would be great to work together with our allies, on flexible manufacturing and making sure that this is standardized, right, that the regulatory approaches are aligned so that we can pool, the potential of these capabilities together and deliver products that, align with our common values. And so we have a series of recommendations on how to do that, on how to work with our partners and allies to both promote the technology but also protect it.
Yeah. And from what you're saying in terms of just the scale of the top-down Chinese model, we need our allies to be able to prevail.
That's right. We will not be able to do it alone.
Fantastic. Like you and the senator have laid out significant challenges, huge opportunities. So this is a Betting on America podcast. Like, tell us, why should we bet on America on this important area?
Yeah. Look, we know Congress has a lot to focus on this year, right? There's a lot of priorities and a lot of things that we need to do. But I think critically, Congress has asked us for these recommendations. They asked us to look at biotech and national security. And as we've said, biotechnology is a U.S. Modern biotechnology is a U.S. invention, right? It is a U.S. strength. It is something that we, is kind of a fabric of our DNA, if you will. So we've laid out a series of focused strategic recommendations that have put into play. We think they're realistic. We think they're achievable now. We can, capture the pole position, which I loved your description on the intro. We can remain at this leading edge, and we can grow jobs all across America.
Dr. Rozo, you've rendered huge service to the country through your work on this commission, and thank you for coming here and sort of sharing all of this with us. Thank you again for joining our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for joining us for this eye-opening conversation with Dr. Michelle Rozo. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more at csis.org, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play. We're coming on the tail end of 45, 40, 50 years of what President Trump and President Biden and now President Trump again have said are people and places left behind. And you're showing through this report and through this work that biotechnology opens up opportunities all across the country in different geographies and in different sectors.
I think our fellow commissioners are so passionate about this is because the potential for job creation all across America. This is something that is accessible. You don't, again, I want to emphasize, you don't need a PhD to fill these roles. These are jobs, good manufacturing jobs that will exist, across the country from coast to coast in those communities that have been left behind.
But before we do that, you ring the alarm in this report about the competition from China.
Yeah.
And you do it in a way that, it really was eye-opening for me, which is we're kind of at this point where, if I understand it correctly, and I want you to describe it in your own words, that they are about to lock in their advantage. And there's a window for us to really make sure that we stay ahead in life sciences and biotechnology. Explain that to us, because this was a big part of this report.
Yeah. And it was one of our most critical findings. So what we'll say is we have, and what we've found is that we have a 3-year window for action, absence which we feel as though China will gain the leading edge and this will be impossible to regain. Because we're waiting for this ChatGPT moment, this inflection point, that when it arrives will create economic, geopolitical, national security leverage, the ability to really move biology to all of these applications, that will create this moat so large that it'll be very difficult to overcome. And while we're waiting for this ChatGPT moment that is rapidly advancing, what we are seeing is a DeepSeek moment occurring in China. The same thing is happening in biology. So we can train foundation models on biological language, the A's and C's and T's and G's that make up the genetic code, or the images of protein structures which underlie how they function. And in doing so, scientists can now more exquisitely be able to ask a foundation model, design me a biological system that can perform this function, like a drug function, and accelerate this design, build, test, learn cycle, and really transform biology into an engineering discipline. So that is what we are on the cusp of. This is what the inflection point is, and when it arrives, it will impact every aspect of our economy, everything from medicine to food to agriculture to industry and defense.
How are communities in the heartland helping the United States compete on the global stage in critical technologies? How are they attracting billions in foreign direct investment from allies in technologies of the future like EV batteries? Are they the forerunners of an American industrial renaissance? I'm your host, Navin Girishankar, and today I speak with the mayor of Kokomo, Indiana, Tyler Moore, about his EV battery. Mayor Moore, delighted to have you, sir.
Delighted to be here with you, Navin. Appreciate the opportunity. Greetings from Kokomo.
Thank you, sir. In fact, Kokomo has quickly become known for the Center for EV battery manufacturing. And I really wanted to understand this story better and understand what's been happening under your leadership over the last few years. And so I really appreciate your taking the time to take us through this. Let me start by asking you, why EV batteries?
Fortunately, with the presence that Stellantis, formerly Chrysler, has had here in the Kokomo and Howard County area for nearly 100 years now, with they being one of the partners of Star Plus Energy, partnering with Samsung SDI, that is the reason why EVs are now part of our community here in Kokomo.
And you're competing on the global stage. This is an important global value chain that you're involved in. An important piece of this story, and I'd love you to elaborate a little bit on this, is the significant investment from South Korea and South Korean companies in Kokomo. And give us some numbers here and help us understand the scale and the depth of relationships between the US and Korean companies in Kokomo.
Yeah, so a little over 5 years ago, this wasn't even on our radar. Part of my initiatives when I first took office was to identify and create a dedicated industrial facility or industrial park in Kokomo. As I had mentioned with Stellantis, formerly Chrysler, being a part of Kokomo and Howard County for over 100 years, or close to 100 years now, our reliance on the automotive industry has been heavy, and we've definitely reaped the benefits of that decade after decade. But there was also an ongoing concern that with Kokomo's reliance too much on the automotive industry, that there was a need to diversify the economy. And that's not something that has been unique to me and my administration, but has been kind of the thought of previous administrations, again, for a few decades now. And with the desire to identify an industrial park area to then turn into a conversation with at that time, yet to be identified partnership that was looking to bring a substantial investment to Indiana, but was also considering both Ohio and Michigan to have that investment land. We then shifted our focus on just a small industrial park to over 300 acres of available land in Howard County, along with an availability of resources with our utilities, and a whole docket of incentives to be discussed. And so as negotiations began and we were informed and introduced to the partnership of Star Plus Energy, again, that being Stellantis and Samsung SDI, we knew that we, as a small community of just under 60,000 population, just under 89 as an entire county, knew that we couldn't do it alone. And so we walked alongside both our local partners, the Howard County government, as well as our Greater Kokomo Economic Development Alliance, but then partnered with and worked alongside the Indiana Economic Development Corporation and former Governor Holcomb's office in starting to put together a package to try and land this incredible investment that at one time was a single battery plant, but now is translated into plans for a second battery plant with a total investment just on the battery plants alone of over $6.6 billion.
Amazing, phenomenal. $6.6 billion, a county of about 89,000, you said, and Kokomo, 59, 60,000 people. There's so much to unpack there, and that's what I'd like to do. Before I do that, I'm going to pull up a chart here, which I thought was really interesting. It's actually from your website. So my team's going to bring this up. And if you look at this, it's basically the employment share in different sectors in Kokomo. And the thing that struck me is that manufacturing, 25%, is the load-bearing component of this. Like, it's the center of gravity. And all of these other sectors, whether it's retail or healthcare or other services, I'm assuming, really service that manufacturing base. And so this is the kind of story when you hear, whether it's President Trump or previously President Biden talking about reindustrializing the US, like, I think that people have this sort of thing in mind. And it's really phenomenal. And you say there are many components to what you did, state and local government, what you're doing at the local level. I'd like to walk through those to understand what's your secret sauce. So let's start with what you've been doing at the local level in terms of infrastructure and services that you're providing to your investors. Like, what are the pieces that you need to put together to attract them?
Right. So with that size of an investment, we knew that with the capacity that they needed, not just on infrastructure, on roads in and around the complex out there, but utilities. I mean, the incredible amount of water and electricity and gas that was needed. Not only were local governments and state governments at the table negotiating, but all three of our major utility providers. And that spoke volumes, I think, to the negotiating team for Star Plus Energy as well, that not only, again, was local government represented, state government represented, Governor Holcomb, former Governor Holcomb himself was at the table every time we met, but then also the top officials of our utilities. And so knowing that they were on board and that they were ready to spring into action and provide the necessary infrastructure utility-wise was a huge factor in landing this investment in Indiana and specifically in Kokomo and Howard County. The speed with which the gas company and water company and electric company, all three have moved in the last year prior to construction or during construction of the first plant was incredible. And again, having all parties not only at the table, but walking in step with the timeline that the Star Plus Energy partners were trying to accomplish, again, was a game changer.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really strong reminder. One is that this is the work of many hands, state and local and private sector. I'd like your thoughts on the role of the federal government in supporting your effort, if any. But I also want to emphasize that you're describing really that there are investments that are needed outside of the actual plant, the actual industry, that to make it supportive. So public investments in infrastructure, we'll talk about workforce as well, but it's creating the fertile soil in which, you know, you can plant the seeds of industrial development. Tell us a little bit more of how you've done that. Yeah.
Well, and that was not only working with the Star Plus Energy partners themselves, but knowing that they were bringing a network with them. They have suppliers that providing the recycling services that they need through the production process, the materials themselves. I mean, so not only was there the need to secure land and make that available for the battery plant itself, but property surrounding and adjacent to that site for the various suppliers. We've got J1 Industries, we've got Solbrain, we've got Sang-A, Sang-Si, Haewu. I know that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to those, but those that are familiar with these South Korean companies would probably be very familiar with this. And the same setup here was one that was in recent years established in Hungary with this partnership. And so recognizing that, our local team took advantage of that and had conversations with the Star Plus Energy folks to say, okay, what worked in Hungary? What didn't work in Hungary? What were some of the challenges? And then as these suppliers came and as the Korean nationals began to work their way in, not only during construction process, but through manufacturing, we wanted our community to be prepared, knowing that there was going to be a culture barrier, there was going to be a language barrier. You know, we've got a nice flavor of international woven into our community as well, but there had not been this type of strong Korean presence. And so embracing that and taking advantage of that, I think, is what helped succeed, if you want to call it a success, and I will, in the transition that not only the executives and through the construction process, but the hundreds of Korean nationals that are slowly working their way into our community to work and to hopefully live.
Yeah, there's so much there. So let's take this step by step. You highlighted here that really you're competing for global investment as a town in Indiana, and you're competing with other locations around the world, and there are lessons to be learned about what they've done. And the Hungary example that you described is really, I think, instructive and potentially instructive to other state and local folks who are trying to do something similar. Like, understand what's the bar around the world. What is it that is going to allow us to exceed that bar to attract investment and keep investment? And then the second thing you said, which I just want to go into, which is the significant investment from Korean companies, but of Koreans also coming to Kokomo, and what seems to be a sort of lively cultural mix that's happening in a small town in the heartland. How have you managed to do that, and what are the issues you've experienced?
Well, one of the things that we recognized early on and have continued to embrace and really foster is that the Korean nationals and Korean companies value relationships, and not just professionally, but personally as well. And so a lot of what they do through their manufacturing and construction process and production translates or spills over into the social aspect of it. Right. I joke that we went, when the announcement of the first battery plant was made, looking at maybe establishing one, maybe two Korean restaurants. We now have 6 working on a 7th. and I've come to absolutely love Korean culinary wares and the food, but knowing that is a huge component of relationship building professionally with their corporations and within their culture. We knew that outside of work, they wanted to have a lot of the tastes of home, if you will, because a lot of those Korean national workers here are on 2-year work cycles. And so there are, I think the term for it is secondee workers. And so they come and work for 2 years, then they have the opportunity then to re-up for a second term or return to South Korea and have others come and replace them. And so knowing that they are here many of them away from their families because they didn't bring some of their families with them and such, that we wanted to have that type of availability to them, recognizing again the importance of food and socialization in their culture, and really embracing that and taking advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah. Look, it begs the question, because a lot of folks, when they think of reindustrializing the U.S., they're thinking of opportunities for homegrown talent for the natives of Kokomo. Now, how have you balanced that? And is the job creation opportunities coming out of this this massive investment spilling over so that folks in Howard County who were born in Howard County are also benefiting from this?
Absolutely, because the workforce that the battery plant will employ will be predominantly, I guess, non-Korean in nature, so to speak. The Korean nationals that are here and part of that production process equate to around 40 to 45% of the overall workforce. So the vast majority of those workers will be secured either through the Kokomo and Howard County area, but knowing, again, we're just a community of just under 60,000 and already have a strong Stellantis manufacturing presence here that employs thousands in our area, knowing that we were going to have to tap into the region, our surrounding counties, even surrounding states. If there are manufacturing opportunities that are going away in those other states, and those folks may be moving here. So we recognize that not only is it bringing job opportunities for those Korean nationals with the Samsung SDI specific equipment and such, but this is creating jobs for hardworking Hoosiers, folks from Ohio, Illinois, even Kentucky that may work their way in. So the opportunities are there, and recognizing that there is going to be this, or there has been this, combining, this molding of melting, if you will, of cultures with the Korean nationals. We've partnered with our Greater Kokomo Economic Development Alliance and held a series of Korean integration workshops for our small businesses, for our first responders, knowing that there was going to be this influx and there was going to be those challenges. So that has been hugely successful as well, and part of the ease within which a lot of the Korean nationals are transitioning into our community.
Yeah. Well, it's a really fascinating story, in a way, a truly American story. I've seen that you've been to Korea. I guess it was the end of last year. You took a delegation with you, in a sense, an ambassador for the U.S. and U.S. industrialization. In your conversations, I'd be very interested in how the Korean investors view the opportunity to invest in Kokomo. Like, what are the benefits of being in Kokomo to them?
Really, a lot of what we heard, and yes, we did have a wonderful opportunity to take a small delegation over at the end of November, mainly to visit the corporation's headquarters that are here. One, to see more of their processes, but also to thank their upper administration and officials for their investment in Kokomo and Howard County. And a lot of the conversations that we had with them while we were there was their impression and their appreciation of word that they were receiving back from their workers, from their leadership here in Kokomo and Howard County, on how well the transition went, on how supportive not only was the local government, but state government was on helping them secure this development and to help their workers transition to America, many of which who had never been to America before in their lives. And so working through not only visas, but driver's license. Who would have thought that driver's licenses would have been an issue? And so a lot of the word that was getting back to them on how supportive we were. I mean, even again, their delight in hearing how many Korean restaurants we had in Kokomo in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I think the appreciation that they shared also echoed the appreciation that they have for the United States as a whole, that assisted them back in the early 1950s after their Civil War come out of the ruins, and to help them get to the international and worldwide prestige that they've become. And so it was just an amazing experience, and I hope to plan another trip back soon.
That's very, very interesting. And I guess the question I've been having, because I was talking to some of our colleagues who study Korean investment in the U.S., and $1 billion and above investments from South Korea in the U.S., in heartland states, in places like Kokomo, are at an all-time high, and they're in emerging and critical technologies, which is really quite fascinating. And the question that comes to mind for me, and I'm just going to ask you to elaborate a little bit, is America the place to do business because it's easy to do business? The ease of doing business is relatively high. That are our workforce and our workers valued by these investors? Do they see our workers as competitive and hardworking and innovative? Could you elaborate on that? Because that's the kind of thing I believe most investors are looking for when they go to a country.
Yeah, I think you hit every single nail on the head with the list that you just gave. I mean, I think a lot of the initiatives and efforts that former Governor Holcomb had done by way of efforts through the Indiana Economic Development Corporation did prepare and create Indiana's business climate to be one of benefit, and the ease with which the available workforce. I mean, you mentioned earlier, what was Kokomo or Howard County's secret sauce in landing this investment. I think a lot of it was the available workforce and the reliance on that, with Stellantis being one of the partners of Star Plus Energy, and again having that long-standing relationship in Howard County with our 4 existing plants. Even back in the early 2000s, around 2008 and 2009, when we were in a recession, the automotive industry was struggling as they were. I mean, Kokomo and Howard County continued to be one of the strongholds for Stellantis, formerly Fiat and Chrysler and such. Yeah. And so I think that translated back to their partner that because of the reliance on the workforce and the great business climate that Indiana has, and a lot of other areas within the Midwest, and specifically through the state of Indiana, I think is exactly what you said, is what is encouraging and enticing this foreign investment, not just from South Korea, but from other countries here in the heartland.
Yeah, and I'm just going to pull up another slide here, which is really interesting because it looks at the impact over the last 7 years or so of household income in Indiana, in Kokomo. And you see that really on average it's been rising. And I think, it's really testament to the work that you've done over the last few years, Mayor. A question is how do we ensure that it sustains? And, when you think about that, I have 2 questions. One is, assuming the EV revolution continues and the EV transition continues is an important assumption, and that you feed into that. And I wonder whether the shift in policy in the U.S. somehow changes that in your eyes, or is that here to stay? And is that something that you think will either be a basis for you providing EV batteries domestically, or as a source of export revenues for the U.S.?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what's happening in D.C. now, with the economic climate and the imposition of tariffs and such, I think I don't know if it's necessarily here to stay. It's something that's, again, being so reliant on the automotive industry that Kokomo and Howard County has experienced through the decades. I mean, the auto industry, we see, ebbs and flows. And now with Kokomo being on the forefront of the EV industry within the automotive industry, I know I mentioned earlier, because of our reliance on automotive and manufacturing, thought, okay, there's probably the need to diversify our economy, but to be able to now diversify within the automotive industry as the automotive industry diversifies itself will, I think, allow Kokomo and Howard County, to remain on the forefront of that and help weather the storms as again, the economy and the industry ebbs and flows. But I think what we need to do here in Kokomo is what every administration prior to mine has done, is to just tighten our belts and roll up our sleeves and then make sure that what we're doing here not only supports the workers and the workforce, but continues to create a climate for the investment and the presence that we currently have and opportunities in manufacturing to continue to exist.
Yeah. That's a great insight, and you kind of touched on something which was something I need to ask you, which is we're in the middle of, I think, a very volatile trade environment. I'm putting it kind of mildly, and there isn't an end in sight as yet. But you're in a global value chain. EV batteries is a global technology value chain with inputs coming from all around the world. Presumably, at some point, you're producing these things, and either it's for the U.S. market or maybe for export. How does the trade agenda and the tariff agenda hit you and hit Kokomo? And how are you managing the risks around that?
Yeah, so it's a concern not just here in Kokomo, but across the country and as you mentioned, across the world. And so I think, again, because we're in the middle of what would seem to be a storm, I think if we all weather the storm, I think it's our thoughts and our hopes that it settles, that the ship gets uprighted, and that what continues to happen will kind of work itself out and get to a position that all can continue to work within. I know that there were some recent layoffs here locally due to some of the recent announcements, but it's our hope is that those are temporary as they were announced. And again, that's something that Kokomo and Howard County and our region is not immune to and hasn't been accustomed to in the past, again, as the automotive industry itself continues to fluctuate from time to time. But knowing that, as in the past, those have been temporary and things seem to work themselves out, that we're going to remain cautiously optimistic that that the recognition that a lot of what's happening does affect hardworking Americans and American jobs, that it will work itself out sooner than later.
Yeah, I hope so too. But to the point with tariffs, it could have an impact on costs for companies like the ones in Kokomo. And then you have significant exposure to an important trading partner that may be on the other side of the tariff agenda. And so I think that I could see some potential headwinds, but I'm sure you've probably dealt with headwinds before over the last several years in your journey here.
Yes, and we as local government or even state government, recognizes the position we're in. We're kind of caught in the middle, and so continue to have conversation with our South Korean partners and investors on their concerns, and making sure those concerns then are related to our local congressmen and congresswomen, to make sure that that the ties and relationships that I may have or other local officials have with those that are representing us in Washington, hear our plight, hear our concerns, and that those conversations are being had and continue to kind of be a mediator between the two as everyone kind of weathers the storm.
Yeah. Well, Mayor, you have a fascinating story in Kokomo and really testament to your leadership, and it's an inspiring story, I think, for many Americans. Let me ask you as a parting question, what lessons would you offer to, say, fellow mayors across the country that are trying to do the same thing that you've done? It doesn't have to be in EV batteries, maybe in other technology areas. What are the 2 or 3 things that you'd leave behind from your experience there for them?
First of all, don't be afraid to kind of suck up the pride, take a step back, and ask questions. I mean, be welcoming and respectful of those that are coming and being willing to invest in our communities and such, and embrace those cultures. I mean, I know, sometimes, we get the thoughts that, this is America, they need to, change and conform to us. They need to embrace what we have here. But I think recognizing immediately and early on that it is a two-way street, that I'm sure other cultures, are just like the South Koreans, that, relationships are important because relationships help build trust. And if they feel that they can trust their local officials who may or may not have the opportunity to create any type of influence and such. I mean, that was one of the interesting things that I took away from South Korea, is that, they thought that I had President Trump on speed dial on my phone, that I could reach out and, when you have a conversation with the president, can you make sure, but knowing that those trains, but again, I think that would be one thing, to embrace the culture and be as welcoming as possible, because they've made a commitment, they've made a choice to invest in our communities. And so we should be just as much, if not more, appreciative of what they're bringing to our communities as to what our communities can give to them. And recognizing that a lot of efforts, not just on landing, but continuing to support these industries and such, takes a team effort. I appreciate your kind words saying that a lot of what Kokomo and Howard County is experiencing is due to my leadership, but I am first to thank those that give me credit for that, but I'm just as quick then to turn and give credit to the team. I have an amazing team on my administration, from our development director to our city attorney to our city engineer. A lot of those that have the communications and a lot more expertise on issues than I do. So the reliance on that is so important to be able to surround yourself with an amazing team of individuals, both at the local level and at the state level. Because again, there is no way at all that we would have been able to have landed this investment and development ourselves. And so having that relationship with our state legislators, with our governor's office, and with our state economic development corporation was vital. So those are definitely two main aspects that I would definitely want to leave folks with.
Well, that's really wise words, Mayor, and I want to just thank you again for taking the time. We're going to watch the Kokomo story unfold, and really best wishes to you and your team, and to all your investors there in Kokomo.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you
as our Korean friends would say, 감사합니다.
Amazing. Thank you for tuning in to this eye-opening conversation with Mayor Tyler Moore. You can find this episode of Betting on America and more on csis.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in Is America the place to do business because it's easy to do business? Are our workforce and our workers valued by these investors? Do they see our workers as competitive and hardworking and innovative? Could you elaborate on that? Because that's the kind of thing I believe most investors are looking for when they go to a country.
Yeah, I think you hit every single nail on the head with the list that you just gave. I mean, I think a lot of the initiatives and efforts that former Governor Holcomb had done by way of efforts through the Indiana Economic Development Corporation did prepare and create Indiana's business climate to be one of benefit, and the ease with which the available workforce. I mean, you mentioned earlier, what was Kokomo or Howard County's secret sauce in landing this investment. I think a lot of it was the available workforce and the reliance on that, with Stellantis being one of the partners of Star Plus Energy, and again, having that long-standing relationship in Howard County with our 4 existing plants. And so recognizing that, our local team took advantage of that and had conversations with the Star Plus Energy folks to say, okay, what worked in Hungary? What didn't work in Hungary? What were some of the challenges? And then as these suppliers came and as the Korean nationals began to work their way in, not only during construction process, but through manufacturing, we wanted our community to be prepared, knowing that there was going to be a culture barrier, there was going to be a language barrier. We've got a nice flavor of international woven into our community as well, but there had not been this type of strong Korean presence. And so embracing that and taking advantage of that, I think, is what helped succeed, if you want to call it a success, and I will, in the transition that not only the executives and through the construction process, but the hundreds of Korean nationals that are slowly working their way into our community to work and to hopefully live.